Jack Parsons, to me, is the greatest, I don't know what to call him, the philosopher, scientist. Jack Parsons is virtually unknown, and yet he was, more than anybody else, responsible for the American space program and the fact that a man has walked on the moon. It's hard for a lot of people to understand. Most people think you're either a scientist or an occultist. You can't be both. Jack Parsons is the classic example of that you can be both. And science and occultism were very closely related. As I mentioned, Kepler and Newton and practically everybody else who was important in the creation of the scientific revolution was also a practicing occultist.
It has reached to the point where many people in the Air Force have the same conclusion, that these things were interplanetary spaceships.
I've slowly come to the conclusion that there are such things as interplanetary spaceships. I'll have to stick my neck out and say that because I believe it at long last.
And it's happening whether Parsons was responsible or not. Some people think his Mojave Venus working was not completed properly, and that's why we're having all these weird UFO phenomena. Whether that's true or not, we are getting ready for outer space just by the simple fact that so many millions of people believe they've had outer space contacts already. They're turning into moon children.
There's life on other planets?
Well, definitely not.
Not?
Not.
Well, what leads you to say that? Scientific investigation, or?
Well, only working off the theory of the Bible.
Born by the name Marvel in the year 1914, Jack Parsons was delivered into the hands of a very well-off family living in a prestigious community in Los Angeles, California. His mother, Ruth, was the daughter of a wealthy businessman who owned 2 companies, including a successful automobile corporation in Springfield, Illinois. And it was there that Ruth met Marvel H. Parsons, the man who would become Jack's father. This inherited wealth afforded a high-class lifestyle for the Parsons family. Jack was a single child who was free to pursue his every whim and pampered by the services of butlers and housemaids and tutors and spoiled to no end. His parents sadly ended up separating when Jack was still pretty young. His father, Marvel, had become ensnared in an extramarital affair with a prostitute, a revelation that Ruth would refuse to forgive despite Marvel's best efforts to resolve their marriage. And Jack was therefore raised mainly by his mom, who, in order to distance the young Jack Parsons from his father, changed his name from Marvel to John. And then later, he finally took on the nickname Jack. Now, it's important to note that Jack Parsons grew up in a world that largely viewed the possibility of space travel as preposterous. But like many children of that time, he was fascinated by science fiction. It was the roaring 1920s, a decade that has come to be known as the pulp era of entertainment. Alongside the exploding popularity of radio entertainment, the movie industry was burgeoning, and things like entertainment journals and sci-fi magazines and various pulp literature were beginning to fill the magazine racks of common neighborhood stores, stirring the imaginations of everyday people with wild adventures about, courageous spacemen traveling to distant planets where epic battles ensue against aliens and robots and everything in between. And while ideas like these may have made for great sci-fi stories, they weren't to be taken seriously by credible scientists at that time. But for a young Jack Parsons, this line between science and fiction wasn't so broad. He approached these topics with seriousness, and viewed such things with a realistic sense of unrealized possibility. And he was particularly fascinated by stories of traveling to the moon, citing H.G. Wells' The First Men in the Moon among his greatest inspirations. It's speculated that it was his love for science fiction that sparked in him a passion for rocketry. In fact, by the age of 12, he was already practicing for his future career in rocket science, creating all sorts of explosive devices and leaving charred mounds of dirt and grass scattered throughout the yard of the Parsons family home. And it was also at this relatively innocent age of 12 that Jack Parsons claims to have conducted his first satanic ritual. It was an attempted invocation. His goal was to summon the devil into his own bedroom. It's a memory that he would later refer to as his, quote, magical fiasco. But it's pretty scary stuff, especially for a 12-year-old. And it was enough to frighten a young Jack Parsons into stepping away from such activities, at least for a while. Now, although he was very obviously intelligent, Parsons performed poorly in school. He was dyslexic and he struggled with reading and writing, no doubt contributing to his unpopularity and perhaps even compelling this increasingly rebellious attitude and unruly behavior, which was becoming a problem. He was described in his youth to have been effeminate and socially awkward in his personality, which I'm sure offered little help in his efforts to fit in. But I think the truth is that high school served as a real culture shock and a reality check for Parsons. Being raised in the lap of wealth and luxury proved to be a handicap in terms of his ability to relate to his classmates, with whom he had little in common. But for all his teenage struggles, he was fortunate enough to have a faithful friend by the name of Ed Foreman. And Foreman was the type of friend that could keep a guy like Jack safe. He had a reputation for being able to hold his own in a fight. And Foreman was this regular world kid, from a middle-class family who, apart from being dyslexic himself, had little in common with Parsons. Ed was tall and handsome and street smart, whereas Jack was, quite the opposite. A spoiled and eccentric rich kid with less than a masculine physique. Ed was also 2 years older than Jack. But their lives crossed paths on the playground one day when a young Ed Foreman saw a crowd of kids gathered around a scuffle that had broken out. He approached the fight and saw that there was some kid on the ground getting kicked around by these bullies. And without warning, Ed Foreman cocked his fist back and just smashed it into one of their faces and splattered blood across his shirt, which caused the whole group to go running off. And laying on the ground below him was Jack Parsons, his dorky and bright-colored sci-fi books scattered around him. And it just so happened that Ed was also a big fan of science fiction, so after helping Jack to his feet, they began talking sci-fi straight away, and an instant friendship was formed. And I know that this sounds like a corny scene from a Hallmark movie, but it's how the story goes. And those that were close to them would define Ed Foreman as Jack's #1 fan. He was just fascinated by everything that captivated Parsons, from his rocket experiments to his interest in the occult and magic. And over time, Parsons would go on to share his knowledge of explosives with Ed, who took to it naturally. And the two would eventually become an inseparable team of young rocketeers, creating rockets and bombs in the backyard of the Parsons home as often as they could with their limited supply of gunpowder. They didn't know it then, but this relationship would thrive into adulthood, and this rocketry hobby of theirs would later become their profession. But for now, Ed and Jack were just two kids who were struggling in school. Now, in the midst of all this, Jack's mom was growing concerned about his academic performance, and so she decided to send him to the Brown Military Academy for Boys in San Diego. However, the school couldn't quell Jack's obsession with explosives and his propensity to cause trouble, and he was ultimately expelled from the academy for setting off explosives in the school toilets. Like literally, he just blew up all the toilets in the bathroom. And when Jack returned to his previous school the following year, he had a newly acquired confidence about himself. No longer was he the unpopular geek that he was before. He was now the kid that got kicked out of a military school for blowing up the bathroom. And let's be honest, that's a pretty awesome accomplishment in the mind of a rebellious teenage boy. I mean, that's the stuff of legends. But meanwhile, his family's financial situation was changing rapidly. They were among those who were deeply affected by the stock market crash of 1929, which unfortunately occurred directly after Jack's grandfather passed away. And his grandfather, of course, was the source of the family's wealth. And to make matters worse, he died right after the completion of the construction of this extravagant and expensive mansion that he was building, which left Ruth and Jack with a giant and beautiful house to live in, but with much less income to cover its expenses. And despite Jack's newly upgraded social status, he was still struggling in school academically. And so by his own initiative, he transferred to the more expensive University Academy, and he even picked up a part-time job to help offset the cost of tuition. He began working for the Hercules Powder Company, a chemicals and munitions manufacturer, which was truly an ideal job for a young rocket enthusiast. And all setbacks aside, Parsons did manage to graduate high school on schedule in 1931, and he continued to work at Hercules, where he was getting a free education in chemistry and explosives, and befriending and talking with coworkers or different departments, experimenting with the company's vast selection of various chemicals and explosive agents. And he didn't realize it, but this was the beginning of his rocketry career. But deep down, he still desired to be a real rocket scientist. But he understood that he would need some credentials to make a real profession of it. And so, in hopes of attaining a degree in chemistry and physics, he decided to enroll in the Pasadena Junior College, strategizing that if he could perform well enough, it could be used as leverage to gain entry to Berkeley or Stanford University. But this turned out to be a failed pursuit that would deplete even more of the Parsons' remaining inheritance. And he was later forced to drop out for a lack of funds. But Jack persisted. He continued to conduct his own independent research and experimentation, and once again, he would find himself setting off bombs in his backyard by the side of his best friend, Ed Foreman. And if we fast forward by 4 or 5 years, they would both finally become members of a legitimate rocket program, and soon Jack would come to be called a pioneer in the advancement of spaceflight, his lifelong ambition. But he was also on the verge of embarking down a wild and wicked spiritual path that would change the course of his life, and perhaps even history itself.
The craters and mountains of our moon bear the names of giants of science, figures like Archimedes, Kepler, and Copernicus. There is also a crater honoring someone called Jack Parsons.
So, after stepping away from his interests in sorcery and witchcraft during his youth, Jack evidently had a change of heart when he reached adulthood. And in 1939, a 25-year-old Parsons and his first wife Helen joined a secret society called the Agape Lodge, which was, in reality, the Pasadena, California chapter of a group known as the Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO, a satanic and mystical cult that was founded near the turn of the 20th century and popularized by none other than the great beast himself, the self-described wickedest man in the world, Aleister Crowley. And Jack was not merely a practitioner of Crowley's satanic religion of Thelema, but a true disciple. Climbing quickly through the ranks and expanding the cult's influence, he soon began a personal correspondence and eventual friendship with Aleister Crowley himself. Now, Crowley, of course, was considered to be a spiritual leader and messianic figure by all Thelemites. But for Parsons, Crowley was also a mentor, and he openly regarded him as even a father figure, which is sort of sad in context with the complicated dynamics of his relationship to his actual dad. And like most disciples, he desired to become Crowley's successor as the wickedest man in the world. He wasn't content as just a mere student of Thelema. He wanted to advance it. And so he would set out to achieve new magical breakthroughs, and often emulating the work of Crowley in his efforts. For example, whereas Crowley was known to address himself as the Great Beast 666 in his writings, Parsons would adopt the title Antichrist in similar fashion. But anyways, back to the plot, where Jack was now fully involved with the engagements of this Agape Lodge. And it didn't take long for Parsons to become one of Crowley's most effective American representatives for the OTO, spreading the cult's influence throughout California pretty significantly. And meanwhile, as he continued to delve deeper into this occult world that he was now a leader within, he was simultaneously advancing a budding career in rocket science. He was by this point involved in a legitimate rocket program. It was a small rocket club that was composed of sort of a ragtag assortment of students from Caltech, or the California Institute of Technology, in addition to Jack and his childhood friend Ed Foreman, who at that time were no more than self-taught amateur rocket enthusiasts, you know? They weren't even enrolled in the school, so it's really crazy that they managed to even be involved in this group. But they did so through their mutual friend Frank Molina. He was an aeronautics graduate student that they previously met at a public event being held at the university. And when Parsons and Foreman explained their experiments and their results with Molina, he was impressed and he took interest in joining them. And Molina had a lot to bring to the table because he had access to a wind tunnel and all the resources available through the university's GALCIT program. GALCIT, it stands for the Graduate Aerospace Laboratories of the California Institute of Technology. And so that'll come up again, so just remember that. And I think it's interesting enough to mention that Frank Molina would later have a son named Roger, who would go on to become a renowned astrophysicist and a distinguished professor, and serves on the advisory council of an institution called METI, which stands for Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And I will also mention that Roger Molina is married to a woman by the name of Christine Maxwell, who is the daughter of the powerful and infamous Robert Maxwell and the sister of Ghislaine Maxwell, you know, the pimp of Epstein Island. I just wanted to mention that because I have no idea whether this is of any practical significance, but history just never fails to reveal these long-standing relationships between the same old elite families that continue to influence world affairs. And so anyways, Molina set out to persuade his supervisor to allow Parsons and Foreman to join the school's rocket program. And von Karman was equally impressed by the experience and technical knowledge of these two outsiders, and so he decided to allow for them to join the team. And it was an unprecedented move that, you know, really speaks to the level of talent and knowledge that Parsons and Foreman managed to acquire independently. And this partnership spurred the creation of the Caltech Rocket Research Program, a small rocket team that would later come to be called the Suicide Squad. And this team was led by none other than Theodore von Karman, the GALCIT director himself. And as another quick detour, I was surprised to learn that von Karman was known to speak openly about his shared heritage with the famous Talmudic scholar Rabbi Judah Loew. This rabbi was a Jewish mystic who was the subject of a famous legend. It's said that through the use of magic and ritual, the rabbi created a living creature from clay that is known mythologically as a golem. And if you have kids, you might notice that the golem is really popular once again via video games like Minecraft or Pokemon. But the existence of this golem was believed to be real by many. It was described as a giant monster, perhaps 8 feet tall, that was made of hardened clay and with glowing eyes. He is said to have achieved this on behalf of his mystical and esoteric knowledge of how God created Adam. You know, and of course, Adam from Genesis was also made from clay, and he is considered by the Jewish Talmud to be the first golem. And there's a whole adventure that ensues according to the legend, which I just don't have time to get into, but I do suggest the topic for your own continued research. And perhaps this famous rabbi's ancestry to von Karman is of no real significance, but it was certainly important to him. And so just keep this in mind as we examine the strange cast of characters that surrounded Jack Parsons in his short lifetime. Now, there are differing accounts of how this rocket club acquired its now famous name, the Suicide Squad. According to some sources, the nickname was coined by students around the campus and it was intended as an insult, you know, apparently due to the dangerous nature of their explosive experiments. And I read that von Karman was embarrassed by the nickname and that he was also aware that some of his fellow faculty members were grumbling about the danger and commotion associated with his group, you know. And so he responded by moving the location of their test site to the furthest edge of the university's property. But other reliable sources have claimed that the guys in the group coined the name Suicide Squad themselves. Now, I suspect that both accounts are possibly true. If the nickname were attributed to them, you know, they probably liked the ring of it and adopted it officially because, after all, it's a really cool name, you know? Suicide Squad, it's awesome. And I suppose the origins of the club's name don't really matter, but the perfectionist in me just can't allow for things like this to go unmentioned. But regardless, although the so-called Suicide Squad was initially regarded as an amateur outfit of thrill-seeking rocketeers, they eventually started developing some revolutionary stuff, game-changing advancements in rocketry. And one of these included something called JATO, which stands for Jet Assisted Takeoff. It was a technology that Parsons helped create and had caught the eye of the U.S. Army.
Navy privateer makes a jet-assisted takeoff at the All-American Air Maneuvers at Miami, Florida.
Now, whether or not you believe that there is any power in magic and witchcraft is up to you, but it goes without saying that Jack Parsons certainly did. And as this small team would go on to enjoy some great achievements in the following years, Parsons was never shy to attribute the group's success to his magic rituals and spellcastings. And as the Suicide Squad pursued their historic mission of getting a rocket into space, it's fair to assume that Parsons experienced it all much differently than his peers, guided by visions and voices and drug-enhanced dreams of space exploration and astral projection. This was all, to Parsons, a massive satanic ritual. But that's not to say that his fellow Rocketeers were unaware of Jack's occult obsession. They simply regarded him as unique and quirky. And after all, the man was a clear genius, and everybody knows that such highly intelligent people can tend to be rather eccentric in personality. And so it went that Jack would continue pursuing both rocketry and magic zealously. It was in 1943 that the U.S. Army made their first purchase of a large order of JATO units from Galset, and with this funding came a more professional image for the group. Now called Aerojet Engineering, the small rocket team had established their presence as a serious contender in the high-stakes world of aerospace manufacturing. And that year, Jack Parsons would start to make a lot of money, and he was spending it just as quickly as he was making it.
Hooray for Hollywood! That's gooey bally-hooly Hollywood, where any office boy or young mechanic can be a panic with just a good-looking plan.
Parsons quickly purchased a mansion in Pasadena, California that served not only as his home, but also as a sort of occult commune and arena for his drug and sex-infused rituals and over-the-top parties. He cleverly named his house the Parsonage, and it would soon become the headquarters for his Thelema-based cult gatherings. And allegedly, neighbors would sometimes complain about things like late-night costume parties or loud live music and open drug consumption and even naked women jumping through rings of fire, that sort of thing. Yet seemingly unaffected by all the chaos and debauchery that he immersed himself into by night, Parsons would continue showing up to work the following day and proceed to excel in his pursuits and make significant advancements in the field. And as I stated previously, his occult practices were no secret. His peers and co-workers were well aware of such activities, as were his employers, the United States Army. But at the end of the day, his genius was really a valuable asset to the team. And so Parsons was sort of living above the law at this time, enjoying an unspoken level of protection from the government due to a mutual interest in his research. And this was no doubt a very convenient arrangement in regard to the controversial activities taking place inside the parsonage. And this increase to Jack's financial status enabled him to invest more heavily into these occult projects. And soon the parsonage was a bona fide headquarters for the local OTO cult. And back at work, now that Parsons and his fellow founders of Aerojet had secured this enormous government contract, they created the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, choosing to use the words jet propulsion and to avoid the word rocket because at that time, people associated rockets with outdated wartime weapons, and also because of its shared connotations with science fiction. And so it was decided that the term jet propulsion sounded more scientifically credible and would be taken more seriously as a technology. Now, today, JPL is sometimes jokingly referred to as Jack Parsons Laboratory, with many believing that his initials are included in the name by intention. But his time with JPL didn't last long, because despite being in good standing with most of his team, Parsons' public reputation as a Satan-worshipping, Crowley-loving party animal eventually became a burden and embarrassment to the growing company, which was by this point directly affiliated with the U.S. government. And he was aware that he was losing favor with his superiors, so in 1944 he accepted a proposition to leave JPL in exchange for his share of the company, which amounted to about $11,000 in severance pay. And keep in mind that this was in the 1940s, so this payout was the equivalent of almost $200,000 today. Now, years later, in 1957, the Soviet Union would allegedly go on to achieve the impossible as they launched Sputnik 1, which is considered to be the first artificial satellite to be successfully placed in orbit. Now, if you were paying attention over the previous chapter of this documentary series, then you should know that I have my doubts about this type of thing. But for the sake of the story, the launch of Sputnik 1 was a giant milestone in the historic space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. And it was an embarrassment to the American space program, which needed to prove that it was also capable of such a feat. And after a spectacularly failed attempt by the U.S. Navy, the government turned to none other than Jack Parsons' laboratory, or the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to be more accurate. And this led to the famous launch of the Explorer, and the rest is history. NASA's website explains it this way: With Explorer 1, JPL vaulted the U.S. into space and prompted the formation of NASA. On December 3, 1958, only 2 months after NASA started operations, JPL was transferred from Army jurisdiction to that of the new civilian space agency. I will add that JPL is NASA's only federally funded research and development center and is regarded as the leading force in space exploration, supposedly sending robots and rovers to Mars, and that sort of thing. You could say that JPL is the tip of the spear for the American space program, and it was only possible through the invention of Jack Parsons' rocket fuel, which has cemented his place among the forefathers of NASA. However, after leaving JPL in 1944, and with a freshly cleared schedule, Jack decided to use his remaining wealth to jump entirely into his occult ambitions. He was, after all, still deeply entrenched in the operations of his Agape Lodge cult. He began renting out rooms in the parsonage and imposed a pretty unusual criteria for potential renters. Essentially, that they must be fellow occultists and eccentric hedonists like himself. And I know that probably seems like an exaggeration, but he actually published an ad in the local Pasadena newspaper that said, "Only bohemians, artists, musicians, atheists, anarchists, or other exotic types need apply for rooms. Any mundane soul would be ceremoniously rejected." And the parsonage became the host to a number of notable figures, such as author and screenwriter Ray Bradbury and Forrest J. Ackerman and many others. But for all the interesting people that would come and go from the parsonage, none were more impactful to Jack Parsons and his cult than the young L. Ron Hubbard would soon become. Hubbard was already a successful science fiction writer, but his true fame would come after he created and established the Church of Scientology.
The Minister of Health for the United Kingdom said in Parliament in 1968, and I quote, "The government are satisfied, having reviewed all the available evidence, that Scientology is socially harmful."
Hubbard first met Jack Parsons in 1945 when visiting the Agape Lodge. Parsons was impressed with his charisma and intelligence, and the two quickly became friends, bonding over their shared interest in the occult and science fiction. And it was also around this time that Jack had decided to divorce his wife Helen, who had become impregnated by a fellow member of the lodge. I'm sure that was a common inconvenience in sex cults. But anyways, don't feel too bad for him, because Jack had already been pursuing a romantic relationship with her younger sister, Sarah. So after divorcing Helen, he had her sister Sarah move into the parsonage with him. But the problem was that Jack's other new roommate, the young L. Ron Hubbard, also had eyes for Sarah. And of course, this conundrum was only exacerbated by the fact that they were all engaging in sex magic rituals together. And according to some biographers, Parsons began to grow suspicious of a seemingly brewing relationship between his wife and Hubbard. However, Jack and Sarah would remain married, and a short while later, Parsons and Hubbard would decide to collaborate together in an elaborate and complex ritual, the Babylon Working, inspired by Crowley's Religion of Thelema and his 1917 novel titled Moonchild. And there were many things that Parsons hoped to accomplish through the Babylon Working, but the ultimate goal was to evoke the manifestation of a magical entity known as the Scarlet Woman of Babylon. And for those of you who are listening to this and can't read the screen, Babylon was intentionally misspelled by Parsons and Hubbard for complex reasons that I don't care to indulge. But Christians should recognize that the imagery of a Scarlet Woman of Babylon is a direct reference to the so-called Whore of Babylon in the book of Revelations. And you got to understand that the expected results of these rituals are always sort of ambiguous and cryptic. Parsons and Hubbard believed that this entity would help them to achieve spiritual enlightenment and to initiate the Age of Horus, as prophesied by Aleister Crowley. Some sources say that Jack's motivation to manifest the Scarlet Woman was to actually have her as a partner in order to birth the Moonchild, as referenced in Crowley's book of the same title. And so the Babylon Working ritual began in January of 1946, and it drew upon a variety of occult traditions, including sexual magic, invocation of spirits, and other demonic and mystical practices. And for the sake of decency, I will not go into detail about the perverse behaviors that these weirdos were engaging in. All I'm going to say is that it included a lot of gross and X-rated interaction between these two highly esteemed men of history. And they continued to practice the ritual over the course of the next few weeks, but things turned sour when it was revealed that Hubbard had been engaged in a secret affair with Jack's wife Sarah all along. But as I mentioned previously, members of the Agape Lodge were also engaging in sex magic rituals with one another, and they slept around regularly, so I'm not really sure that their marriage ever counted in the first place. And besides, by this time, Jack himself was already engaged in an affair of his own with a woman by the name of Marjorie Cameron, a talented artist and poet and fellow occultist who was equally as charismatic as Jack. They met shortly after his first attempt at the Babylon working ritual, when she had come to visit the parsonage in January of 1946, and it was reportedly love at first sight between these two. For Jack, it was actually more of a matter of destiny. He considered Cameron's recent and unexpected arrival to be a result of his rituals. You know, he thought that she could be the Scarlet Woman. And if you recall from my description of the Babylon working, the next step after you evoke the Scarlet Woman is to conceive the Moonchild. And so they got to work right away. According to the book Sex and Rockets by John Carter, Jack and Cameron would spend 2 consecutive weeks locked away in his bedroom at the parsonage shortly after meeting. And this is pretty gross to visualize, but as the two were doing the deed, L. Ron Hubbard reportedly towered above them while chanting rites and incantations in an unsuccessful effort to evoke the Moonchild in Cameron's womb. And when Parsons and Cameron finally left the bedroom, they would continue a passionate relationship that was characterized not only by their infatuation with each other, but also by their shared interests in magic and the occult. And they would continue various rituals to achieve the conception of this Moonchild, but without success. And anyways, despite the preoccupations of the various affairs that ensnared the entire group, Jack and Hubbard would continue to progress the Babylon working. That is, until Hubbard disappeared one day, abandoning the working to ride off into the sunset with Jack's wife Sarah at his side. And by the way, this is a great example of why open relationships are pointless. But here's the kicker. As if stealing his best friend's girl wasn't bad enough, Hubbard also robbed Parsons blind and took all his money after he received a large loan towards an investment that Jack shared with him in good faith, only to be ripped off when Hubbard disappeared and never repaid his loan, which left Parsons with a significant debt and beginning a cycle of financial struggles that would remain until his death. In a letter that Parsons would later write to Aleister Crowley, he would describe the founding Scientologist as a confidence man and a thoroughly dishonest and insincere individual. And he may have been disappointed by this betrayal from his wife and former best friend, but both were easily replaced by his new girl, Marjorie, who preferred to be called by her last name, Cameron, by the way. He considered Cameron to be spiritually superior to everybody else. She was a fellow Thelemite, and in Jack's mind, her very presence was the manifestation of his own magic. And now, as a couple, the two began working together towards their magical goal of ushering in the Aeon of Horus, just like every other disciple of Crowley. And she was kind of like his new and prettier version of L. Ron Hubbard. They would conduct satanic rituals together and engage in all types of weird sex magic in accordance with Crowley's proclaimed great work, and they were trying to achieve what Thelemites referred to as the true will. But despite their best efforts, these rituals didn't seem to be working out that well for them. And in the years that followed, Jack and Cameron's relationship would deteriorate into an on-again, off-again type thing, and Parsons would begin to acquire significant debt. And so he started taking on different small jobs and receiving loans from friends to get by. And eventually, he and Cameron started doing some work in Hollywood with some of their culty friends in the entertainment industry. Jack's expertise with explosions had some real value in the world of special effects and pyrotechnics, and so he would work in the movie studio by day and in a gas station by night. And although this was certainly a far cry from the prestigious conditions that he was accustomed to, it was a fitting routine for his lifestyle. And then Cameron would go on to actually star in a few movies, including Kenneth Anger's cult classic, The Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, in which she played the role of, the Scarlet Woman. And many scenes from this famous movie were actually shot at the parsonage, with Parsons himself working as a special effects consultant for the film.
I knew a wonderful woman who appears in my film as the Scarlet Woman in Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. Her name was Marjorie Cameron, but as an artist, she just used the name Cameron. And she was the widow of Jack Parsons, who was the adopted son of Aleister Crowley. And Parsons, he was a scientist as well as an occultist, which is a very strange but compelling combination. And he had invented the fuel that took the rocket to the moon. That was Jack Parsons' contribution.
And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called wormwood.
And through it all, Parsons would remain active in his various pursuits of magic and sorcery until his mysterious death by explosion in 1952. Upon hearing the news of his death, his mother Ruth would sadly overdose on pills and die by suicide merely hours after the passing of her son. And just like everything else in his lifetime, even Parsons' death continues to be a matter of conspiracy theory and suspicion. The official story is that he died by accidental suicide, a simple mistake of mishandling explosive chemicals. However, many people believe that he was actually murdered. And this presents an entirely new rabbit hole and deep dive which I just refuse to explore for the sake of time. And the same could be said about many other topics that came up in my research of Jack Parsons that I chose to bypass, including things like spiritual apparitions being summoned in the presence of attendees at the parsonage, or that he worked for Howard Hughes for a period of time and reportedly stole materials from Hughes Aviation, which resulted in an FBI investigation that targeted Parsons with the charge of espionage. And then, of course, there was a time that Jack either created or attempted to create a homunculus, a magical yet physical creature that requires a relatively disgusting ritual to accomplish and rings back to that famous Golem of Prague story that we went over earlier. So believe me, there is no shortage of absurd and unbelievable claims that you're going to find in regard to the life of Jack Parsons if you choose to research it further. But this is where I'm going to draw the line. And this is also where most documentaries on the topic would end, with Parsons being the sole example of a loose connection between spaceflight and the occult. However, this is where our story truly begins.
In Washington, ghost-like objects dart across the radar screen at the CAA Traffic Control Center at National Airport for several hours, traveling more than 100 miles an hour. Air Force jet fighters spend several hours chasing the objects plotted on the radar scope.
On July 19th and 20th of 1952, radar operators at Washington National Airport detected a number of unknown objects moving at high speeds and making sudden changes in direction. Pilots in the area also reported seeing strange lights and objects in the sky. These sightings caused a flurry of media attention and sparked government investigations, including a top-secret study conducted by the U.S. Air Force called Project Blue Book. More on that later. This historic UFO event sent shockwaves through the country and really captured the imaginations of the people. This was at a time in history when science fiction was really exploding into the culture, and this concept of aliens visiting us from outer space was becoming exponentially more popular. And keep in mind that this was only a few years after the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting and the infamous Roswell event, both of which occurred in 1947. And as the whole country marveled at these unidentified objects in the sky, for Cameron and some of the remaining members of the Agape Lodge, they perceived it to be related to the death of their former leader, Jack Parsons. Perhaps this was evidence that his Babylon working and that their efforts to bring about a new era of spiritual transformation were having an impact on the world. But Jack's former OTO companions were not the only ones to draw connections between the ritual workings of Jack Parsons and this sudden emergence of high-profile UFO sightings. Actually, several of his occult contemporaries have suggested that Parsons may have neglected to properly conclude the Babylon working rituals, perhaps failing to seal the magical gateway that he claimed to have opened, and thereby implying that these UFOs and interdimensional aliens could be freely passing through the spiritual portal left behind by Parsons and Hubbard, somewhere in the Mojave Desert. And although it's a pretty radical idea, the theory was not confined only to the occult community. According to some sources, this possibility was actually taken seriously by a small faction of people from within the U.S. government. In his book titled Final Events, author and researcher Nick Redfern tells the story of a secret paramilitary group that was allegedly formed in the 1940s to investigate this theory. The official name of this group is not known, but they are referred to as the Collins Elite. Now, according to these reported claims, the Collins Elite was a clandestine organization within the United States government that was established to investigate the relationship between this burgeoning UFO phenomenon and the secret affairs of occult societies like the OTO. This group was comprised mainly of Christians and otherwise religious members with a shared belief that these entities were nothing more than demons or fallen angels in the disguise of aliens from outer space. So really they sound like my kind of people. But unfortunately, I don't have any evidence to prove that the Collins Elite ever even existed. And I can't stress enough that the information regarding this group is really scarce, but absence of evidence is never evidence of absence. And I think they definitely deserve a mention here, considering the subject matter of this film. Not only for the group's connection to the demonic reality of the alien deception, but also because they were said to have been closely connected to our subject, Jack Parsons. And it was the notoriety of Parsons himself and his ritual workings that apparently spurred the creation of the Collins elite in an effort to defend and counter the supernatural effects of ritual magic. And I don't want to spend much more time on this, because again, it's an unverified claim. But for those of you who enjoy researching this stuff, I'd really like for somebody to dig up more info on the Collins elite, because it really is a fascinating story, albeit a pretty loose-ended one.
Flying saucers have invaded our planet. Washington, London, Paris, Moscow are key targets. The whole world is under attack. Can it survive?
My wife and I are the only ones left alive.
Now, of course, whether the famous UFO sightings of 1952 were at all related to Jack Parsons is anybody's guess. But you might be intrigued to learn that Parsons reportedly had a deep fascination with UFOs, even claiming to have experienced several sightings himself that were, in his mind, connected to these occult practices. And perhaps the most enthusiastic advocate for this idea that there was a connection between the magic of Parsons and this sudden increase in UFO activity was none other than his widowed wife, Cameron. She was known to be deeply interested in ufology, believe it or not. She believed that the phenomenon was not only of scientific importance, but also of spiritual significance because, like many of her occultic peers, she perceived there to be an intimate relationship between the paradigms of astronomy and magic. And like her husband, she had also documented at least one of her own UFO sightings during her time at the parsonage, that she described to be a large cigar-shaped object in the sky. And according to author Margaret Haynes, she and Jack considered this sighting to once again be related to their efforts in the Babylon working. And to make matters more, weird, I guess, within months of Parsons' death, Cameron would go on to gather a group of fellow magicians into a little cult that she named the Children. Now, members of the Children were intentionally selected from various races, and they would consume copious amounts of drugs and then engage in a variety of sex magic rituals under the direction of Cameron, who now believed that she was operating under the occupation of a new spiritual identity called Hilarion or Hilarion. And this Hilarion thing, by the way, is another deep and dark rabbit hole that I am choosing to sidestep for the sake of time. But anyways, her intention for the Children cult was to create a breed of mixed-race moon children who would be devoted to Horus. So it was a continuation of her pursuits with her late husband. And alongside the ritualistic orgies that were being conducted by the Children were your classic meditation sessions that were devoted to contacting or attempting to communicate with these cosmic and interdimensional beings. And in typical alien cult fashion, she would eventually begin to warn her followers of a coming apocalypse by which they would all be rescued by aliens and spaceships. And remember, this is the widowed wife of Jack Parsons that we're talking about. And it's easy to assume that Cameron was simply exploiting the newest paranormal trend, but the truth is that long before the idea had ever crossed the average Joe's mind, these notions of different worlds and alien civilizations and even alien visitations were already common beliefs within the mysterious world of the occult and mysticism. One popular idea in these circles was the concept of cosmic evolution, a philosophy that was popularized by the famous occultist Helena Blavatsky, or as she's more commonly known, Madame Blavatsky. Or Blavatsky. I know I got a Wisconsin accent, I can't help it. But anyways, she was the founder of the Theosophical Society. And by the way, if you're not hip to what Theosophy is all about, in short, it's an esoteric and occult-based religion that was formed in the late 1800s. That is mainly based on occult teachings, but also borrows heavily from Buddhism, Hinduism, and Eastern mysticism. And keep that in mind because Tibetan Buddhism plays into the history of this stuff a lot more than you would expect. In fact, Blavatsky's co-founder and president of the Theosophical Society was a man named Henry Steele Olcott, who eventually would step away from Theosophy to study Buddhism exclusively. And he would later become historically recognized as the first well-known American of European descent to make a formal conversion to Buddhism. And I should also note that Theosophy has served as a springboard and foundational source for many of the New Age religions and philosophies that surround us today. And long before conventional science would endorse this notion of distant alien civilizations, Blavatsky was teaching that the universe was teeming with intelligent life and that human beings were just one part of a vast cosmic hierarchy, with ritual magic being the key to the transcendence of mankind. And this belief was echoed by many of her occultic peers, including Aleister Crowley, who believed that contact with extraterrestrial beings was possible through psychic or spiritual means. And on the topic of extraterrestrials, here's a quote that has been credited to Crowley.
My observation of the universe convinces me that there are beings of intelligence and power of a far higher quality than anything we can conceive of as human, that they are not necessarily based on the cerebral and nervous structures that we know, and that the one and only chance for mankind to advance as a whole is for individuals to make contact with such beings.
And I admit that I'm getting sick of having to bring up Aleister Crowley every 5 minutes as we go through this history, but this is important because Crowley had claimed to be in conversation with various interdimensional beings throughout his ritual workings. Most famously, his Book of the Law was said to be written under the possession of a disembodied voice that called himself Aiwass. Now, of course, anybody with an ounce of wisdom would surmise that Aiwass was obviously a demon, especially in context with the message that was communicated, as it relayed a prophecy of a coming new age, the Aeon of Horus that I keep talking about. And I suppose that I should have done better to define this Aeon of Horus earlier, but the Aeon of Horus is the prophesied satanic paradise that Parsons and Cameron and Hubbard and so many others worked diligently to bring about. The Aeon of Horus could easily be summarized as an age of the Antichrist because it describes a lawless and atheistic culture that targets Christianity specifically and rejects the authority of God to embrace sensuality and humanism instead. And some intellectuals like to praise the insight of these golden era occultists like Aleister Crowley, crediting him as a progressive and forward thinker and marveling at the revealed accuracy of his vision of a hedonistic and godless future. But I am not so impressed. In my opinion, it's pretty easy to accurately predict the future when your prediction is in line with the prophesied word of God. Of course, this suggestion that humanity will one day embrace an antichrist and reject God, well, that's a biblical truth. Of course, Crowley's vision stops short of the part where Jesus comes back and literally kills the Antichrist and his armies while destroying their beast system in the process. But anyways, Crowley published the Book of the Law in the year 1904, claiming it to be a transcript of the message that was channeled through him from this spirit Aiwass. And over a decade later, in 1918, Crowley managed to summon another interdimensional being. He was engaging in a series of rituals called the Amalantra workings. Much like the Babylon working, the purpose of this endeavor was to create a portal to the spiritual world. And apparently he was successful because this strange creature was said to have manifested in front of him. This picture that you're looking at was not taken from the show X-Files. This is a portrait of the supposedly real-life entity that was drawn by Crowley himself. He maintained that this was an accurate portrait of the being as it stood before him. And this entity either called itself Lamb or it was named Lamb by Crowley. But either way, he considered it to be of interdimensional origin. According to Crowley, Lamb went on to communicate to him some cryptic messages regarding the secrets of life. And there's a lot to unpack in this supposed interaction, but what I found the most interesting was Crowley's claim that when asked to define the nature of our universe, Lamb simply responded by saying, "It's all in the egg." following year, Crowley displayed this portrait of Lamb at his own public event in New York, which he named the Dead Souls Exhibition. And beneath the picture was the following inscription.
Lamb is the Tibetan word for way or path, and Lama is he who goeth, the specific title of the gods of Egypt, the treader of the path, in Buddhistic phraseology. Its numerical value is 71, the number of this book.
And there's one of those Buddhist connections that I told you to look out for. You see, Crowley was actually pretty fond of Buddhism and Hinduism. He actually devoted a lot of his lifetime to the practice and promotion of yoga, which, by the way, I'm sure that the popularity of yoga today is yet another facet of modern culture that Thelemites might attribute to the presence of the Aeon of Horus, but let's get back to the point. And to be honest, I have no idea where Crowley is getting his definition of Lama from. I could not verify that it means he who goeth. I tried to research the definition and etymology of the word, and to the best of my research, it just means venerable one or superior one. But regardless, I assume Crowley to be much more scholarly than I am, so we'll just go with his definition on this one. But anyways, I was able to confirm that the word lamb does indeed mean path in Tibetan. In Buddhist practice, it's most likely derivative of the term lamrim, and it represents what Buddhist practitioners recognize as the path to enlightenment. And you will soon understand why Lamb is an apt name for this entity in Crowley's portrait. But the first and most obvious question is whether or not it's a coincidence that this Lamb bears such a close resemblance to what we have come to know as the gray alien. Because you can't tell me that's not what comes to your mind when you look at this guy. And first off, considering that this sketch was made over 100 years ago, perhaps it would be more appropriate to ask why our modern concept of gray aliens bears such a close resemblance to Lamb. I specify the gray-style alien because, as I assume you are aware, the public's perception of aliens and even the spaceships that they supposedly travel in has changed drastically throughout history. It's easy to see a difference between the metallic flying saucers of the 1950s and 60s and then the more sophisticated and high-tech style UFOs that are often reported today. And upon close examination, it's easy to see all types of similarities that exist between UFO sightings in any given year and the UFOs that are imagined by popular science fiction movies or shows of that same period. And it's an important point to understand because the same thing was true about the public's perception of the aliens who were supposedly piloting these UFOs. In the 1950s and 1960s, many people believed that extraterrestrials were human-like in appearance, but their skin color and clothing and other details varied widely. They were described similarly in many reported close encounters from that time as well. And before that, aliens were often envisioned to be more monstrous in appearance, with features like tentacles and scales or wings. And even further back, in the late 1800s, there was a common belief that aliens could be living on the moon or on Mars, and that they had developed advanced technology. And these beings were often depicted as physically superior and high-tech humans, but only with, futuristic clothing and advanced tools. And you can keep doing this all the way back throughout history, to a time before the concept of intergalactic civilizations was even a thought in the minds of most cultures. And yet people still had their sightings and abductions and close encounters even back then, many of which have been preserved through the lens of folklore and mythology. But instead of recording alien spaceships in the sky, people were keeping record of gods and thunderbirds and fairies and dragons flying around. And instead of being abducted by aliens, there were reports of abductions by trolls and monsters or spirits, and you get the idea, the history goes on. And of course, if you go back far enough, you're going to be left with the Bible, which doesn't describe aliens at all, but only God and his angels, and then these deceptive and cunning fallen angels who would love nothing more than to be accepted and embraced by humanity, even if it's in the disguise of something else. Remember that in Matthew 24, we are warned that there shall arise false Christs and false prophets and show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. And never forget that even Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light, according to 2 Corinthians 11. And on the topic of masquerading demons, I think it's interesting that so many of these alien encounters that we hear about include the combined elements of mental telepathy and spiritual messaging. Perhaps even the majority of experiences play out this way, with the entranced abductee receiving a familiar message about a coming climate apocalypse or a great war, and this urging of the necessity for humans to unite into some type of New Age universalist religion. And if I try to be unbiased, I just can't imagine a rational explanation for why some random and unrelated creature from a galaxy far, far away would care about the spiritual conditions of human beings on Earth. But through an occultic lens, these experiences are really not very different from the way Crowley described his interactions with Aiwass. Not only in the method of communication, but also the message that's being communicated, one of a coming new age of human enlightenment.
I seem to become one with the entire universe. Everything in the universe seemed to be contracted down to one small dot.
We are going to see more and more of these visitors from space, and that before too long, the evidence will be incontrovertible, that you will have on your TV screens and on your movie screens concrete evidence that the ships are here.
And this brings us back to Lamb and his gray alien doppelgangers. I think it's clear to see that as of today, these guys have become the poster boys for extraterrestrial life.
You were saying also these gray ones are the ones that we see most of the time, and you said that most of that there are a lot of different motives for them being here. The gray ones, what kind of a deal we got going with them? Is that the bunch that you suggest we've made a deal with for military technology?
I think we made a deal with them, and their ultimate, what they want to do is regenerate their own race.
You believe in part that the movies E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, were not entirely just the creative products of some Hollywood director, that maybe there's more to that. Why don't you explain?
They were carefully guided by representatives from MJ12, who is this organization that is in charge of the cover-up, in order to get us ready for the release of the information that there are indeed aliens. And in both those movies, they used small little creatures and in order to get us ready for this release of information.
To prepare us that the idea of benevolent aliens from outer space are going to help us out.
Unfortunately, they're not so benevolent. So they made probably one of the most disastrous mistakes when E.T. was put out. At that time was before we discovered what I call the double cross or the grand deception. And they were trying to get us used to the benevolent little creatures, but that isn't the case.
Return viewers may have noticed that I often use Wikipedia as a source for these documentaries. Not because I consider Wikipedia to be a reliable or credible source of information per se, but because I know that the majority of the world that I'm reaching out to does. And while writing this, I was surprised when I looked up the Wikipedia page for gray aliens and saw this picture of Lamb prominently displayed on the page and reported in the article, where this image is declared to be amongst the earliest depictions of a creature of this appearance, more commonly recognized as a modern gray alien. But Lamb's association with ETs doesn't end here, because within the last years of Aleister Crowley's life, he met and befriended a young man named Kenneth Grant. Grant was a British ceremonial magician and an admirer of Crowley's work, and like many others, he aspired to become the successor of the so-called Great Beast, and he served him directly as a secretary and personal assistant. Historians of this topic debate about whether or not Grant was Crowley's official successor, but that's really not of much importance to me. But anyways, if you'll remember, we have discussed the UFO wave of 1952 that occurred a few months after the death of Jack Parsons. Well, by that note, it's interesting that Aleister Crowley died on December of 1947, the year that initiated this modern UFO craze with the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting, as well as the crash in Roswell, New Mexico, which occurred that same year. And it seems coincidental, but in the mind of disciple Kenneth Grant, there was a significant connection between the timing of Crowley's death and the occurrence of these famous UFO events. And in the time that Grant spent working under Crowley, the two would grow really close. And knowing that Grant had developed a deep interest in Lamb, Crowley had decided to ceremoniously present him with the original portrait of Lamb as both a gift and also a supposed magical resource. And then sometime after Crowley's death, Grant would create the Typhonian Order, an offshoot of the OTO. And while his new cult would maintain the general precepts of Thelema, it seems to me that the Typhonian Order was more primarily focused on ritual or psychic communications with non-human entities, by which Lamb was and continues to be a prominent source. And over time, Grant would become increasingly outspoken regarding his belief in UFOs and the topic of ufology, and he would write about it somewhat frequently throughout his 9-volume Typhonian Trilogy series of books. And I mean, keep in mind that I haven't read through these books personally, but it's pretty easy to confirm amid the many quotes and excerpts that flourish all over the internet. And he included this now famous portrait of Lamb in numerous publications. One of his more outstanding beliefs was the idea that Lamb was in fact the same entity as Aiwass, that disembodied voice that Aleister Crowley supposedly channeled in his Book of the Law, that I spoke on earlier. And in his book, Outside the Circles of Time, Grant describes Lamb to be a, quote, extraterrestrial and praetor human intelligence. And he even claims that Lamb is now known to be a link between the star systems of Sirius and Andromeda. He also goes on to explore the mystical significance of the number 71, which Crowley originally attributed to Lamb in 1918, if you'll remember. And it's a number that continues to pop up in relation to ufology, by the way. And furthermore, it was a number that was of special significance to Grant because it was similar to his own numerical magical identity of 718 or 718. And I know that this opens a whole new can of worms regarding numerology and gematria, but we're just going to save that for another time. Just understand that in the same way that Crowley regarded himself as 666, Grant's number was 718. So just keep that in mind because it will come up again shortly. Now, according to Kenneth Grant's philosophy, this otherworldly and alien-like appearance of Lamb was itself the very purpose of Lamb's presence. He viewed Lamb as a gateway and conduit to another world, or to put it in more practical terms, as a path of exploration into another realm. Grant once wrote,
"If man is able to integrate these new experiences into his psyche, he must begin now to think in terms at least of extraterrestrial encounter. If he does this, the rest may follow. The faculty of intuitive insight may be awakened and aligned with such alien concepts."
And to say that Lamb has become a central figure in the Typhonian Order would be an understatement. As time went on, Grant would develop a new faction within the Order by the unambiguous name the Cult of Lamb. It was a group that would devote themselves to pursuing this path of Lamb. And if you think I'm exaggerating, then let me draw your attention to this excerpt that I took from an internal memo from within the organization of the so-called Typhonian Order about the Cult of Lamb that was written by Grant himself.
The cult has been founded because very strong intimations have been received by Eosic Iwast 718 to the effect that the portrait of Lamb, the original drawing of which was given by 666 to 718 under curious circumstances, is the present focus of an extraterrestrial and perhaps trans-Plutonic energy, which the OTO is required to communicate at this critical period, for we have now entered the 80s mentioned in the Book of the Law. It is our aim to obtain some insight not only into the nature of Lamb, but also into the possibilities of using the egg as an astral space capsule for traveling to Lamb's domain, or for exploring extraterrestrial spaces.
And at the end, it's signed off by Kenneth Grant using his silly magical name. So you can see that this association between Lamb and extraterrestrials goes far deeper than his similarity in appearance to our modern gray aliens. And although this information may not be a smoking gun of evidence, I hope you'd agree that we've covered some pretty interesting and substantial connections so far. But we're really just getting started. According to reported statistics, it is the gray alien who is most commonly associated with the phenomenon of alien contact or alien abductions. They are also the entity that is most prominently reported in close encounter claims that include the elements of telepathic communication or psychic visions. Actually, they're the most common entity involved with all close encounters in general. Now, before the Greys came along, aliens were generally imagined to be, benevolent intergalactic travelers from distant planets who were just simply passing through. But unfortunately, these new and supposed real-life gray aliens were much different. This wasn't the same narrative that was previously recycled through decades of science fiction. And it was clear that these aliens were more than just visitors from another planet. It would seem instead that they were operating according to a mysterious agenda in which human beings seemed to be the subject. And instead of landing peacefully on the White House lawn and saying, "Take me to your leader," or incinerating the White House with space lasers, they were seemingly more interested in the affairs, beliefs, behaviors, and personal lives of regular everyday people, and interacting intimately with targeted individuals, beaming telepathic messages to them and teleporting them to different worlds, or materializing through the walls of their bedrooms, and taking control of their minds and possessing their bodies. All the type of stuff that you or me would probably immediately recognize to be demonic activity. Anyways, I think it's safe to assume that Kenneth Grant probably didn't share my attitude towards demons. However, Grant's speculations regarding a link between the arrival of these aliens and the death of Aleister Crowley are perhaps strengthened in light of the fact that the 1947 Roswell incident happens to be the first historical instance of people encountering these little gray lamb-like creatures. Although no alien bodies were initially reported by the media, of course, numerous eyewitnesses have later affirmed the claim that alien bodies were present at the crash site, describing them to look like little gray men with big heads. And this also explains why in ufology these gray aliens are sometimes referred to as Roswell Greys. And now, in the wake of all these numerous UFO-related incidents that transpired between Roswell and the wave of 1952, society was left to ponder the broad implications of how the existence and arrival of these alien beings would potentially impact our lives. And it didn't take long for the newly validated UFO phenomenon to start influencing culture in dramatic ways.
How many trips have you made to outer space?
Well, I'd say 350 or a few more.
When was the last one?
Well, first part of June.
I have made telepathic contact for the past 8 years with many space people from many areas of space, both inside and outside of the solar system.
The 1950s saw the inception of the so-called contactee movement, a subculture of various individuals and quasi-religious groups who claim to have been in direct and friendly contact with extraterrestrial beings. Many of these contactees claimed that in their telepathic communications with these apparently benevolent aliens, that they would receive utopian visions of a new world and a coming enlightenment, or sometimes that they would receive warnings about a nuclear war or environmental catastrophe. According to the testimony of many contactees, these aliens would encourage the subject to embrace humanistic ideals of things like free love and sexual liberation, and all the stereotypical tenets that would soon be the rallying call of the coming hippie movement. And on average, most of these alleged conversations, predictably, seem to instruct the contactee to spread a message of open borders and spiritual unity on Earth. The first, and probably most famous of these contactees, was a man named George Adamski, who claimed in the year 1952 to be in telepathic communication with a humanoid alien being from Venus named Orthon. And even though I think astronomy is mainly a bunch of BS, I still do find it amusing that the planet Venus would later become regarded by astronomers as a gas planet that is unsuitable for life. Because it certainly doesn't add much credibility to these reports of Orthon. But actually, Adamski wouldn't be alone in his miscalculation. You see, at this time, Venus was considered by some prominent scientists to be a likely contender for life, and it would become a primary residence for many of the so-called aliens that were communicating with these contactees here on Earth. But perhaps it even goes a little deeper than that.
The Bible uses the term devil, Satan, and Lucifer to refer to the same creature. Same one. There's no confusion whatsoever. But in the occult world, the name Lucifer is a very powerful name. Very powerful. And they identify themselves with that name Lucifer. And you would be amazed at the groups that identify themselves with the name Lucifer, because it means light bearer. Now you go back a little bit of history, and I'll give you this for just a moment. The bright and morning star, or the morning star, there is a planet in the heavens that is called the morning star. It's Venus. This planet, oddly enough, shows up in the sky right before the rising of the sun. And it is the brightest object in the sky outside of the sun itself. The brightest. Far brighter than any stars that are out there, yet it's a planet. And Venus was considered by the Romans, who are who is where Latin comes from. Venus was considered by them to be the morning star. All right? And Lucifer means the same thing to the Latin or to the Roman. It means morning, brightness, the coming star.
Check this out. Earlier in the film, when we went over the Babylon working, the infamous series of rituals conducted by Parsons and Hubbard in the Mojave Desert, I didn't mention the fact that the Babylon working has been strongly associated with the planet Venus. This is because the Scarlet Woman was associated with the goddess Venus, as both were believed to embody the shared qualities of beauty and sensuality and creativity. And so the Babylon working was thus seen as a way to tap into the energies of Venus to engage the transformative magical ritual. And furthermore, Parsons and Hubbard would actually schedule their rituals to be in accordance with the astronomical location of Venus. And then check this out. If we look at the seal of Babylon here, which first appeared in Crowley's Book of the Law, you will see that the seal is based on the symbol of a septagram, or a 7-pointed star. And like all symbols, it holds several different meanings depending on the context of its use. For example, on the Australian flag, it's said to signify the unity of the 6 territories and states of the Commonwealth. And of course, in basic geometry, the symbol has no deeper meaning beyond its shape. And it was used in early Catholicism as well to represent the 7 days of creation, as well as the 7 fruits of the Spirit, among a whole bunch of other biblical representations of the number 7. But if you ask me, symbols like this have never been a legitimate part of biblical Christianity. And it's still a pagan symbol, even when being used by well-meaning Catholics or whatever. The truth is that this symbol originates directly from the Kabbalist tradition of Jewish mysticism, and it plainly represents none other than the planet Venus. In fact, the septagram, or as it's also called the heptagram, is the symbol that is most commonly associated with Venus throughout most occult traditions and even ancient history. And this includes Crowley's Thelema. And therefore, I hope that you'll share my intrigue in the fact that the Babylon working was directly targeted towards the same planet of Venus that just so happens to be the hotspot of all these alleged contactee communications. And so you'd think that when popular science shifted its view on the potential for life on Venus, that would have been a huge hit. But in reality, this revelation was not very consequential to the followers of Adamski, who himself didn't seem to be overly concerned with credibility anyways. Because throughout his career of selling books and arranging public appearances, he was largely perceived as a con man and storyteller by many of his more serious ufologist colleagues. You see, unlike most self-proclaimed contactees, George Adamski provided numerous articles of evidence to support his claims, mainly photographs of alleged UFOs which he claimed to have captured himself. And over time, many of these photographs have been proven to be fraudulent, and it obviously cast doubt onto the whole lot. Yet somehow, even after being practically exposed as a hoax artist, he would maintain his group and continue to thrive within the community of the UFO subculture. And as society's interest in the topic of alien contact increased, so did the rise of George Adamski. And if you're wondering why I would include a known liar and hoaxer like Adamski, in this otherwise serious investigation, I would remind you that in effect, he was no less deceptive than everybody else that I've addressed in this video so far. We're not talking about honest men here. We're talking about magicians and witches and warlocks who are like their father, the devil, who was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth because there is no truth in him, meaning the devil, and that's a paraphrase of a verse in the 8th chapter of John, where Jesus goes on to say that when the devil tells a lie, he is speaking out of his own nature because he is the father of lies, meaning he's not even capable of telling the truth because, again, there is no truth in him. And in this verse, Jesus is merely addressing the Pharisees, so then how much more would this apply to these cult members who openly engage in magic and witchcraft? Even the honest ones are liars because they themselves believe a lie. And so whether these people are lying about channeling spirits or whether they are truly channeling spirits who are themselves liars, the point is you just can't trust them. But fake UFO photographs aside, George Adamski actually had a lot in common with those previously mentioned. He was himself deeply interested in the occult. See, there's something you have to understand about Adamski. Although he's mainly remembered in relation to his UFO claims, I think that Adamski's real interests had less to do with the UFO aspect of his cult and more to do with the cult itself. You don't have to dig very deep to learn that George Adamski was actually the leader of numerous cults. He was like a serial cult leader.
And he does speak very well English as well as in the other language.
Did he tell you where he came from?
Yes, this time he told me he was from Venus, although I have met men from other planets as well.
He started in California in the early 1930s when he founded what he called the Royal Order of Tibet, a neo-theosophical organization that doubled as a lucrative winery. And I guess that's just the snake in him, But take note of his inclusion of this word Tibet. And he reportedly ended the cult's operations when the prohibition went into effect, which served a devastating blow to the group's income of wine sales. Because Adamski was really big into making money, So I guess that was the end of that cult. But years later, Adamski would return to the spotlight, this time as the leader of another mystical group by the interesting name Universal Progressive Christianity. I don't know, it sounds like something Bethel Church might be involved with. And not too much is known about this endeavor, but it seems to share the same traits that you would expect from a New Age Universalist cult. And despite all of his previous efforts, it turned out that Adamski would not achieve the true fame that he sought until he began his public campaign as a UFO culture guru. And despite being regarded today as a charlatan by most, his influence in the founding of the contactee movement cannot be overstated.
Arnold counted 9 objects in echelon formation. He observed that they had no tails and described them as saucer-shaped objects. The story was picked up by the wire services.
He saw what?
In the next 24 hours, virtually every newspaper in the country ran the story. The Arnold report precipitated an avalanche of sightings from cities, towns, villages, from every section of the country.
The commercial aspects of the saucer situation were not overlooked. Alert businessmen and manufacturers came up with all sorts of oddities. The practical joker moved in. Homemade saucers of all kinds and descriptions began to turn up promiscuously. Within a few months of the original saucer report, practically everyone in America was conscious of flying saucers.
Adamski would later be joined by another occult enthusiast and prominent ufologist by the name of George Hunt Williamson, who also got his start in the summer of 1952 when he began to host what he called contact sessions, where he invited others to join him in his efforts to contact extraterrestrials through the use of a homemade Ouija board. That's right, he was contacting aliens through a homemade Ouija board. Now, I suppose I could just end the documentary here because, I think the connotations of this are pretty clear. I mean, what kind of technologically advanced and independently evolved biological creature from a distant planet would communicate through a Ouija board? But believe it or not, this practice is actually a lot more common than you'd think. Just Google the terms Ouija board combined with extraterrestrial intelligence and see what you find. And it's also interesting to me that the Ouija board would be homemade, because of course if Williamson were here today, he could have simply picked one up from the children's toy section at Walmart, but that's beside the point. He would also employ numerous other dark arts into his so-called contact sessions, including the practice of automatic writing, which is a popular method of divination that's kind of along the lines of how Crowley wrote the Book of the Law all those years back. And anyways, Williamson would continue to work side Adamski for quite a while. And much like all the other contactees, he would publish a number of books that detailed his interactions with these aliens and also espoused all of his occultic philosophies, like you should be coming to expect by now. But by the 1960s, George Hunt Williamson had disappeared from the contactee scene, and he's purported to have even changed his name to further distance himself from his previous affiliations, apparently going so far as to invent a fictional backstory and even family to accommodate his new persona. And later, under his new name of Michael Obenevich, he was ordained as a priest in the Liberal Catholic Church by Archbishop Garrett Munich, and he became the priest of a small congregation in Cornville, California. Anyways, it's definitely an unlikely destination for a man who would first come to prominence for his use of Ouija boards to communicate with aliens. But as you can see, Christianity has its own esoteric and mystical factions that are all caught up in this stuff as well. But I hope that by this point you're starting to see the concept of ET communication for what it really is, which is sorcery. And it's not just an element of sorcery. It's not just an infiltration by this small faction of occultists. No, magic was always at the center of this whole thing. In hindsight, I suppose I should have expected that, because after all, what is telepathic communication if not divination? And of course, as a Christian, you wouldn't need to know all this information I've been sharing just to recognize that the contactee movement was clearly demonic in nature. But I guess that I just came into this project expecting that the average contactee probably was just a wacky and science fiction obsessed oddball guy, just making up stories. Or maybe a con man that's just cashing in on this profitable genre of literature, but I was really surprised just to see how many of them have these recorded associations with occult groups, and often in positions of leadership, mind you. It's not like they were the exception to the rule, but these type of characters are the rule. And the more you look into these people, the more obvious it becomes that this movement that we're looking at was not a trend, but an agenda. Another popular contactee from this period, as well as a fellow cult leader, was George King, creator of the Aetherius Society, which is a theosophy-based religion that was formed in the 1950s in response to his alleged contact with extraterrestrial intelligences. And like the other false prophets that we've covered, King started out as nothing more than a run-of-the-mill human being. He grew up in a family that considered itself to be Christian, although his mother claimed to also be a psychic and a clairvoyant. And actually, as a boy, George King would accompany his mother in these attempted faith healing sessions, so I suppose that being raised according to this not really Christian tradition of fake miracle workings is a fitting background for a man who would later create his own cult, because if you're divine enough to perform miracles, then, why shouldn't you be a cult leader? But anyways, before becoming the divine leader of his religion, he was a mere taxi driver. And like Crowley before him and many others, King was also a self-described master of yoga, and he believed himself to have achieved the deepest state of meditation, which is known in Buddhism as samadhi. And so naturally, yoga is a central practice of the Aetherius Society. And I say is because the Aetherius Society is still active, with over 30 embassies located across several continents. So the name Aetherius Society. Well, King named his religion Aetherius after the alien entity that he claimed he was in psychic contact with. And by the way, the Aetherius Society refers to extraterrestrials as cosmic masters. And can you guess what planet that Aetherius and these cosmic masters were contacting King from? That's right, Venus, of course. But George King would take things up a notch when he went on to claim that even Buddha and Jesus Christ himself were also citizens of Venus.
I mean, I opened my eyes and he was there. He was very tall. He was dressed in a long robe, which covered the usual type of one-piece suit that several people have spoken about in the past when they have met people from other worlds. He had long brownish hair, light brownish hair. Now, it's strange that I could see the color of this, but I could, because there was so much radiance around the man. And I knew, although he didn't tell me, but I knew that he was Jesus, and I knew that he'd come from the planet Venus. I didn't have to be told, I just knew this. I think it was some telepathic impression that I picked up. It was very strong, there was no denying it, and there was no denying his presence. And
so that's George King, who, by the way, is still considered by his followers to be the most impressive and amazing and incredible human being of all time. According to them, he's been the recipient of countless awards and medals and honors and credentials, and of course none of this is backed up with evidence, but those claims continue to be made. And regarding these credentials of George King, he was actually challenged by none other than famous skeptic James Randi. This guy. Who doesn't love this guy? But anyways, Randi challenged many of George King's titles, including his use of the title Doctor and Reverend and even Sir, as if he was knighted, I guess. But as you see, we got this continuation of this blatant deceptive behavior that's being demonstrated again here. But it just seems to be par for the course with these people. And so that covers the first three guys named George on my list.
We all love to talk about the mysterious and the unknown and the flying saucers. So now it's to George Van Tassel and this question.
Have you ever gone up close enough to touch one to see what was inside?
Bill, in August the 24th of 1953, I went aboard one for about 20 minutes.
What was it like? What happened?
Well, the interior walls were what looked like mother of pearl plastic, like we put on toilet seats and for decoration. The light inside seemed to come from everywhere. The instrument panel wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, and all of my years since 1927 in the air game. And they had a compartment in the wall which both cleans and deodorizes their clothes by some light process, which required no water, soap, or detergents, or a washing machine.
So according to Van Tassel, his telepathic communications with aliens also began in the year 1952, just as was the case with many others. And once again, these messages were coming from Venus. Now, Van Tassel was a very wealthy man who owned a lot of property. And in 1953, Van Tassel organized what was kind of the first UFO convention that he named the Giant Rock Space Convention, because it was located at the scene of this, giant rock. And this giant rock was a location that some ufologists believe to be a hotbed for UFO activity. And the Giant Rock Space Convention would become a popular annual event that would draw thousands of attendees. And I suppose you won't be surprised to hear that Van Tassel was also the leader of his own UFO cult, which was called the Ministry of Universal Wisdom. Now, I could have made an entire documentary about this guy, but instead I need to summarize it into a few paragraphs. So first off, Van Tassel was not perceived to be a con man with fake credentials or bad evidence, like George Adamski or Billy Meyer, who we didn't really get into, but you could look that guy up yourself. But no, his credentials were legitimate. He was an aeronautical engineer of reputable stature in his field. Perhaps somebody more like Jack Parsons in reputation, a credible voice making really incredible claims. Now, that's not to say that he wasn't accused of being a crackpot and lunatic by, the more conservative scientific community in regard to these contactee claims, but Van Tassel's advanced level of intelligence and technical knowledge was irrefutable to those who knew him.
Baxel, you have a time machine plan. You have done experiments which show you can bring the past to life. Where did this formula come from?
I love that Scotch accent. Jack, the formula came from a ship that landed at my airport in 1953 on August the 24th, which had 4 people aboard it that came from another planet.
I'm breathless.
Well, you're not only breathless, I was breathless.
But I'm cynical, too.
Well, that's fine. That's the way to be. In fact, I'm a bigger skeptic than you are of many things.
I'm an unbeliever. Convince me that this really happened to you.
Well, this thing is very similar to a thing that happened in our biblical records where our Lord presented Moses with a pattern to build a tabernacle. They came out of the sky, they handed him stone tablets, and this phenomena that's taking place today is as old as our history, as our civilization. This isn't anything new that's occurring. It's something that's being continued in another time of crisis when conditions affecting the people of this planet are reaching a point where somebody has to take care of the situation.
Now, I don't intend in any way to be disrespectful or blasphemous, but do you feel, and I know you're not an evangelistic type, do you feel that you're some kind of Moses receiving a new word?
Well, I don't say that, Jack. I say that what is occurring now has occurred before. There's many records of these ships landing throughout history, clear back into Sanskrit. And there are records in the 1898 Chicago newspapers that covered the front page for 3 days of a big ship setting over Chicago. When you realize we're dealing with a type of man that is almost as far above us in intelligence as we are above the lower animals, there isn't anything phenomenal in this at all.
And alongside of his efforts in the contact community and his contributions to ufology, his real passion in life's work was to build a large structure that he called the Integratron, half building, half machine, which was essentially supposed to be a free energy generator. And according to Van Tassel, he received the design for his Integratron from an extraterrestrial named Salganda, obviously from Venus, while aboard his alien spaceship. The structure was said to be a spiritual successor to the Tabernacle of Moses from the Book of Exodus, and its machinery was designed according to the wireless technologies of Nikola Tesla.
He was picking up signals from Mars.
Tesla reported this otherworldly communication and proclaimed his belief in extraterrestrials in February of 1901 in an article for Collier's Weekly titled "Talking with the Planets."
And despite the unbelievable nature of its origins, his hand-built Integratron is widely regarded to be an architectural masterpiece, constructed without the use of any nails or screws or metal fittings by using various methods of what's called joinery, a complex woodworking technique that I really know nothing about. And anyways, it's still operational and well-maintained. Today, it's said that the interior design of the Integratron produces nearly perfect acoustics, and sources that were close to Van Tassel claim that when operated properly, the structure would successfully power up and create a field of energy that would cause amazing real-life effects to take place within its walls. Depending on who you'd ask, it could be described as anything from a unique and geometrically complex building to a time machine or a spiritual healing center. Of course, it also served as the ideal location for devil worshippers to summon demons, or as newspaper articles might put it, for contactees to communicate with aliens.
One of the great things about the desert is the clear night sky. The farther away you get from the big city lights, the brighter the stars and planets above us shine. The mythical Integratron in the high desert town of Landers provides an ideal location to witness the upcoming Perseid meteor shower. You're invited to bring a blanket to lay out and experience the meteor shower outside and take in a sound bath inside the Integratron during the annual event that benefits the Mojave Desert Land Trust. The Integratron is an acoustically perfect dome that sits on a powerful geometric vortex in the Mojave Desert. It was designed in 1957 by George Van Tassel as a rejuvenation machine for the human body.
And it's all about to come full circle for us now, because George Van Tassel would later meet and become close friends with this familiar old witch, the wife and scarlet woman of the late Jack Parsons, Cameron. She was with a new guy at this time, and her new boyfriend actually relocated to stay with Van Tassel for a while, practicing with his followers and assisting him with these contact sessions. But it turns out that his relationship with Cameron was not his only connection to the life and work of Jack Parsons. Like Parsons, Van Tassel was a true aeronautics expert and a qualified technician. And as it turns out, both men worked, at separate points in time, for Hughes Aviation, owned and operated by famous pilot and film producer and real estate agent, and just all-around entertainment mogul and legend, Howard Hughes. And as I alluded to earlier, Parsons was actually investigated by the FBI for allegedly stealing documents from Hughes Aviation. And as I said before, it's a complicated and convoluted rabbit trail that I'm choosing to sidestep. But I will mention that Marjorie Cameron was of the opinion that Howard Hughes himself was actually behind the death of Jack Parsons. Anyways, it does appear that Van Tassel's relationship to Hughes Aviation was a lot less turbulent than Parsons. And we're almost done with this segment, but there is one more so-called contactee from this period that I want to mention, and that's Daniel Fry. And Daniel Fry was another contactee who gained a level of prominence in the UFO circus of the 1950s. But he was different from the other guys I've mentioned so far. Not only because his mother didn't name him George, but also because he wasn't a cult leader, nor was he openly affiliated with a cult. I guess he was an annual speaker and attendee of George Van Tassel's convention, so I guess he was part of Van Tassel's cult in that way. In which, again, I've already proven that Van Tassel's cult was indeed another satanic cult, so scratch everything that I just said about Fry not being in a cult. He most definitely was. But anyways, the reason that I wanted to include him in this is because of how much his life happens to overlap with that of our somewhat central character, Jack Parsons. First off, when Fry was 11 years old, he moved to Parsons' hometown of Pasadena, California. Like Jack, he was a young amateur rocket enthusiast, and as he got older, he took full advantage of all the rocketry programs and events which flourished in that area that we went over earlier. Now, he was 6 years older than Parsons, so it's unlikely that they would have been close friends, but it is reasonable to assume that they could have known each other. Daniel was in that same fold of young rocket scientist wannabes of Pasadena that Jack and his buddy Ed Foreman would soon become part of. And, he would also attend these public events at Caltech and lectures or exhibitions by Galset. And much like the biography of Parsons that we've already been over, Fry was also a talented chemist, that also intended to pursue a degree in chemistry but was forced to drop out because he couldn't afford university. And finally, like Parsons, both men did manage to cultivate successful careers in rocketry without having qualified education. But anyways, in 1949, Fry would go on to land a job with Aerojet, the company that was literally founded by Jack Parsons, and after working there for 5 or 6 years, he would go on to help create the Crescent Engineering and Research Company, a successful business that manufactured rocket parts and specialized in repairing none other than JATO rockets, the legendary invention of Jack Parsons. And it was upon beginning his new job at Aerojet that Fry had his first alleged UFO encounter. As the story goes, he was just walking a trail some summer day when he noticed an unusual spherical-shaped craft hovering above him. And of course, this craft would then descend from the sky above and land directly in front of him. And according to Fry, he began to receive telepathic communications from its pilot, who was apparently still in outer space, and controlling this landed craft remotely from a mothership that was 900 miles above Earth. And so I guess this spacecraft was more like a drone. And Fry goes on to claim that he was then invited to board the remote-controlled spacecraft and was flown from White Sands, New Mexico to New York City and back in 30 minutes. From here on out, it's just your stereotypical contactee story. The aliens would teach Fry all types of esoteric information, and they would reveal secrets of the universe and promote the same New Age propaganda that comes up in the majority of these stories. And as a testament to how substantial the impact was that this contactee movement had on culture at this time, just check out this ad from the 1960 presidential campaign of Gabriel Green. Green being another contactee and student of Theosophy and the Occult. He would run again in 1972 representing the Universal Party, along with none other than Daniel Fry as his vice presidential nominee. Although both of these campaigns were predictably very unsuccessful, it certainly highlights the relative influence that the alien contact movement was having in America at this time. I mean, in fairness to history, this whole contactee movement was met largely with ridicule, and it really wasn't taken seriously by most people in the media or general public. However, it seems to me that these events definitely helped to popularize and also normalize this concept of alien contact. You know, conditioned by the incessant media coverage of UFOs and contactees, the public was growing accustomed to these ideas. I mean, it was still a fringe topic, but one that was becoming less controversial by the year. Now, as of today, this whole movement is generally regarded as a joke, and with good reason. I mean, it's not difficult to argue that all of these godless knuckleheads probably weren't making psychic contact, with friendly alien beings out there just minding their own business and living out their lives on distant planets. But if you haven't figured it out yet, witchcraft is real. And demonic interactions are real. And I think that a lot of people who practice witchcraft don't even understand that that's what they're doing. And I also think that demons are on constant lookout for susceptible humans who are foolishly opening themselves up to this type of relationship. So if these aliens in question were actually demons, which I think I'm making a pretty decent argument for here, then I would say that many of these contactees were being honest about their communications, because we know that communication with demons through magic and ritual meditation is not only possible, but it's biblical. And to be clear, it's strictly forbidden. And I also wouldn't consider it a coincidence that this type of messaging continues to rally around the same New Age and New World Order propaganda that's being pushed onto society more so now than ever before. And if I didn't know any better, it would almost seem like all of these aliens from Venus in the 1950s were actually just employees of the United Nations and just promoting Agenda 2030 all the way back then, but I'm pretty sure that's not what was going on. But moving forward, as we consider the implications of this coming alien deception and potential invasion, I think perhaps we should look back at this era when the act of summoning demons, or also known as communicating with aliens, became a popular cultural trend. And I hope that you can comprehend the significance that all of this was happening alongside the growing popularity of alien-themed science fiction, in a society that was also being simultaneously razzled and dazzled by new advancements in technology that were changing the public's perspective of the future. And all of this hype around UFOs and alien contact only expanded as we headed into the 1960s, because the 1960s were a transformative period in the entertainment industry, both in the magnitude of impact that it had on culture, but also the increasingly propagandized nature of the content in popular entertainment. It was the first generation in which the average American family owned a television. So TV was no longer a novelty of the wealthy, and shows like Star Trek and Outer Limits and Twilight Zone were being broadcast into millions of living rooms, and movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes were mainstream hits. I mean, of course, the 1950s saw its fair share of classic alien-themed movies too, like War of the Worlds and The Day the Earth Stood Still, but by the end of the following decade, it had totally pervaded public consciousness. And for the few of you out there who somehow don't understand this yet, mass media continues to be the primary source of influence on our modern culture. I suppose that's another topic for another movie, but I think it's clear to see in hindsight the magnitude of ways that our culture has been influenced by fictional entertainment, and how much modern scientific thought was influenced by science fiction. And I really hope that I've done well to communicate that fact throughout this film, because it's a really important factor to keep in frame of the context of everything we're discussing here. And while writing this movie, I continue to ponder and just be reminded of the importance of belief and faith in context to how people interpret their own spiritual experiences. It's something that I think about often, as it relates to my own faith in Christ. But even when I research another religion, or even satanic occult groups, as in this case, I do acknowledge the potential for followers of these false religions to produce some possibly legitimate results by the practice of their faith, and even perhaps according to their rituals. Now, of course, if this is true, it's only possible through the permissive will of God. In fact, everything that Satan does is through the permission of God. But the Bible does speak of magicians and sorcerers who were able to perform some limited feats of amazement, and seeming miracles, like replicating some of the plagues in Egypt in Exodus, when they attempted to mimic the miracles of God. And of course, these magicians were losers, and they weren't powerful in the true sense of the word, but foolish heathens who were playing with spiritual dynamite and consistently failed to thwart the will of God or to ever really impress the followers of God. Honestly, it's not impossible that a lot of these biblical magicians could have been just mere illusionists, like David Blaine or Chris Angel, and just relying on trickery or sleight of hand. And they certainly weren't too impressive in the book of Genesis when they were unable and helpless to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And of course, Joseph, a man of God, was able to do so through his faith in the actual God. But the point is that magic is real, so to whatever extent that might be, it's real. And its presence here in modern society is not an invention of these historic satanic cults, but it's represented in the culmination of each and every religion or spiritual system which opposes the one true God. That's the way the Bible would put it. You're either for God or you're against him, and if you're directing your worship or putting your faith in any other God than the one true God, well, then you're putting your faith in a false God, and to communicate with a false God is magic. And honestly, from my perspective, it seems like magic has never really been more popular than it is right now in this current generation. I'm watching a society that has succumbed to the magical pursuit of what's being called manifestation techniques, and there's all these popular outlets now that promise that you can create your own reality, and we could even initiate the physical manifestation of our desires through the practice of religiously visualizing and affirming its existence in our minds. And this type of thing, it's just standard magic. But in a godless society that promotes witchcraft, the general public is now none the wiser, and people tend to take an empathetic and innocent view towards these things because it's dressed up with all this modern lingo, and we see it promoted through sources that are perceived to be wholesome, like Oprah Winfrey or Disney, but make no mistake that this concept of manipulating reality through concentrated meditation is the essence of what ritual magic is really all about. And it's why rituals like the Babylon Working and others involve chants and imagery and reading, and most importantly, repetition. It's all about aligning your mind and spirit with a concentrated and focused intention to manifest whatever it is that you desire to manifest. And when multiple practitioners focus their combined energy on the same image, or the same idea simultaneously, then its potential for success should be strengthened accordingly. And of course, the more sincere the practitioners, the more potent its effect. So this is the philosophy of magic. And it was no doubt the belief that was shared by Parsons and many of his visitors to the parsonage who saw UFOs in the vicinity of that location. After all, they were trying to summon them. And the same could be said about the location of the Giant Rock Space Convention that I mentioned earlier, where large crowds gathered to participate in contact sessions. And there's a lot of historical examples that seem to show that when multiple people get together and start meditating and focusing on UFOs, sightings are not all that uncommon. So could it be that these aliens are truly responding to the calls, and making appearances to those who want to believe? And if that's the case, then how much more prevalent should we expect these sightings to be across a society that would become exponentially saturated in the lore of alien visitation and alien invasion? Because this was no longer the same world that Jack Parsons grew up up in, where ideas like space travel and intelligent life on alien planets were merely the stuff of fantasy. No, this idea was now being suggested and even postulated by the mainstream media. And whatever these aliens were, and whether this UFO craze was related to real-life extraterrestrials or deceptive demons, or even simple figments of the public's collective imagination, there was no denying that society had become lost in space. And science fiction had now reached its golden age, and with topics like aliens and spaceships and intergalactic travel becoming its most popular and dominant theme. And one of the most influential books from this era was Stranger in a Strange Land by legendary science fiction author Robert Heinlein. Published in 1961, the story centers around a character named Valentine Michael Smith, a human who is raised by Martians and then returns to Earth with these incredible powers and a unique perspective on life and spirituality. And then this character goes on to invent a religion on Earth called the Church of All Worlds. And this religion incorporates all types of occultic elements, and various spiritual traditions, including paganism and Hinduism and Western esotericism. Now, what's interesting is that 1 year after the publication of Stranger in a Strange Land, the book went on to inspire a real-life religion by the same name of the Church of All Worlds. And this religion still exists and thrives today, apparently. It's described as an American neo-pagan religious group whose stated mission is to evolve a network of information, mythology, and experience that provides a context and stimulus for reawakening Gaia. And in case you don't know, Gaia is like the goddess of Earth. And so once again, we're seeing this call to religious unity, the one common theme among all these UFO cults, as well as just New Age religions in general. And this Heinlein-inspired Church of All Worlds also publishes a magazine that is of relative popularity within these circles called Green Egg. Because of course, remember, it's all in the egg. And it's another thing I'm going to avoid delving into for the sake of time, but you can find some issues of the magazine online if you feel inclined. You'll see that its pages are filled with nothing but magic spells and pagan rituals, and occasional articles penned by prominent atheists and occultists or science fiction writers. And it's certainly not something that I'd encourage you to consume regularly, but I think it does help you to understand the robust relationship that really does exist between modern philosophy, science, and witchcraft. Now, Robert Heinlein was not only a prolific science fiction author, but as a former accomplished aeronautical engineer, he was a voice of scientific authority. His books have been widely acclaimed by the academic community, who could appreciate Heinlein's reputation for scientific accuracy. And as it turns out, Robert Heinlein was also a close personal friend with none other than our man Jack Parsons, and the two would correspond regularly. And I find it really interesting that such a scientifically minded person like Robert Heinlein would resonate with Parsons' more abstract and spiritually based perception of astronomy and the nature of our universe. But that seems to be the case, and they would discuss these things regularly. Some have even speculated that it was his conversations with Parsons that served as an inspiration for Stranger in a Strange Land. As a quick tangent, whenever I think of Robert Heinlein, I think of my dad. Because my dad was one of these kids from this era who loved to read science fiction. One of his favorites was called Tunnel in the Sky by Heinlein. And so I was sort of disappointed to learn about his associations with the occult and with Jack Parsons and all this stuff, but when you really start digging into these topics, you'll get used to becoming disillusioned in your perspective of history. My dad also loved the book Battlefield Earth, which was written by none other than L. Ron Hubbard. But I actually read and enjoyed Battlefield Earth as well. And don't get the wrong idea, it's not like my dad was into Scientology. Really, the only books that I would ever see him read regularly were his Bible and My Utmost for His Highest by Oswald Chambers. But no, the reason I bring up my dad is because he was born right in the middle of this timeline that we're focusing on, in the mid-1950s. And in his youth, he loved to read science fiction just like so many people from that generation did. And as a kid, I loved to hear him talk about all these old stories that he remembered from these old science fiction books, His eyes would just light up as he recalled these exciting adventures and unexpected plot twists, and all the amazing technologies and incredible worlds that you read about in these classic science fiction books. And as we've seen, science fiction has been the primary catalyst that has now pushed the one-time occult belief in alien civilizations and interstellar travel into the socially accepted mainstream worldview of modern times. And to quickly allude back to Jack Parsons, it's clear to see how dramatically science fiction and fantasy novels would motivate his pursuits in both science as well as magic. In fact, Parsons was a proud member of the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society, and he was a personal friend to a number of legendary science fiction writers, including Ray Bradbury and A.E. Van Vogt and Jack Williamson, and of course Robert Heinlein and the infamous L. Ron Hubbard, just to name the most notable of them. And it just seems like these connections never end. And here's another one. Not only were Heinlein and Hubbard both close friends with Jack Parsons, but they were also friends with one another. Very good friends, actually. And I didn't know this before I started writing this movie, but it's widely believed that the two men, meaning Heinlein and Hubbard, made a bet in a bar one night to see who could successfully create a religion first. And if it's true, then Heinlein's Church of All Worlds would have been his attempt, and then L. Ron Hubbard would have been the clear winner with the success of his Scientology. And you know what? It almost just seems crazy enough to be true. But despite the popularity of the story, I wasn't able to verify it. But still, even if it's just an urban legend, it is reassuring to know that I'm not the only one drawing these comparisons. And before moving on, since I mentioned earlier that I had enjoyed the book Battlefield Earth by L. Ron Hubbard, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that the movie version, which stars famous Scientologist John Travolta, is supposedly one of the worst movies ever. I mean, it's apparently really, really bad. But, however bad the movie is, it couldn't be any dumber than his religion of Scientology.
Hubbard first came to public attention as a science fiction writer. Many of his policy directives and much of his philosophy seems to reflect that background. Its purpose, according to its charter, is to propagate a religious faith known as Scientology. A sign in the window advertises a tract on mental health.
Everything that one reaches for in Scientology is always beyond you. And at each level that you're at, there is that fear factor that if I don't do this right, they won't let me have the next.
I basically wanted to reconcile a situation within my family so that my wife and I would have common objectives. And as a result of that, entered and progressed along as far as I could.
I signed what is a contract. I signed a contract for 1 billion years. 1 billion years.
Members invite people in the street to come in for free personality analysis. A W5 researcher who took the test was then asked to sign up for an initial course costing $25. Later courses can come in packages that cost up to $3,000. The courses often include a process called auditing with a machine called an e-meter. A Scientology publication claims that such auditing may improve the subject's IQ. This 1 billion year contract would appear to be, legally, an unconscionable document. The implication is that the signer will continue to serve the organization in future lives. Hubbard has said Scientology is as important to mankind as the invention of the wheel and the arch. Devotion to the Scientology creed is costly. An individual can spend as much as $8,000 trying to reach the improved state known to Scientologists as clear. These are just a few of the courses Scientology offers. Each course has a prerequisite, which also costs money. The church doesn't talk about fees, but states that payment for these courses is a donation to further the cause.
My thoughts are that they're afraid to really admit that they got took. Completely took. Every single one of them
Not true.
But you were duped, Mother.
I was not duped, Susan.
Mother, you were.
Okay, I grant your beingness to think I was duped. But I know I wasn't. I know I have benefited.
But Mother,
And any benefit I have had outweighs any detriment I have had.
An advertisement for the e-meter. Scientologists call it a confessional aid. The machine measures galvanic skin resistance. Similar instruments are components in conventional lie detectors.
Have you ever been a member of a communist party or any associated group?
No.
All right. Have you ever had any unkind thoughts about L. Ron Hubbard?
No. For a Scientologist to have an unkind thought about L. Ron Hubbard would definitely be considered an outness, and the person having such a thought might be considered suppressive.
Have you ever had any unkind thoughts about L. Ron Hubbard?
No, not really.
All right. Your needle's floating. And that's the end of the session. That's it. You can put the cans down.
I'm sorry, I don't have to admit that it ripped me. I don't believe that it ripped me. I'm the only one in this whole room that doesn't believe it ripped me. And I really, really, really mean that.
I don't agree with you.
I don't agree with that.
Okay, fine, you don't have to. But I know Scientology does have a truth. It has the truth, as I see it. It's there, and I want it.
There's a lot of truth in the Bible. Everywhere in life.
Listen.
And of course, Scientology is like the premier UFO religion, you know, teaching that humanity was transported to Earth 75 million years ago in a giant spaceship that was directed under the leadership of an alien god named Xenu. And according to L. Ron Hubbard, this Xenu was a real tyrant. He was the highly respected and powerful leader of the so-called Galactic Confederacy, which governed a bunch of different alien planets. But unfortunately for Xenu, his draconian and tyrannical ways would come to an end when he was eventually overthrown by the Confederacy and sent off to live in solitude on some desert planet where he still lives to this day. Again, according to the theology of Scientology. In Scientology, the human body is considered to be a mere capsule for the soul, which they call a thetan, or thetan. I think it's thetan. Anyways, Hubbard taught that when the body dies, the thetan goes on to what he referred to as a landing station, where it is then cleansed and replaced into a new capsule and then sent back to Earth. And I also bet you won't be too surprised to learn that this spiritual landing station is located on the planet Venus. I mean, obviously, right? And these are just a few examples of the wacky theology that somehow continues to impress so many Scientologists. Now, in my opinion of reading through Hubbard's account of humanity's origin and the history of the universe, it's humorously similar to reading through his science fiction stories. And the method of research that he employed to construct this backstory for his religion was conducted by recalling his own alleged past lives and then interviewing a large number of his followers about their past lives. And then this would become the source by which all of his theology was based. And from the downfall of Xenu to the rise of the Thetans, the story plays out, you know, just like that, a story. Hubbard himself even called the demonstration of his theology space opera, a term already associated with an existing genre of science fiction. The official website of the Church of Scientology describes space opera this way. Space opera has space travel, spaceships, spacemen, intergalactic travel, wars, conflicts, other beings, civilizations and societies, and other planets and galaxies. It is not fiction and concerns actual incidents. And apparently Hubbard had no apprehension in weaving his theology with science fiction, explaining that the stories were either literally true or that they encapsulated a true idea or event. And for a price, Hubbard would vaguely relay these stories to his congregation in an esoteric and convoluted way that would leave even master-level Thetans confused about which parts of the story were supposedly true or deliberately fiction.
Do you ever think that you might be quite mad?
Oh, yes. The one man in the world who never believes he's mad is a madman.
And by the way, all of this information that I just gave you is really valuable because in Scientology, you got to spend money and purchase information to advance in the ranks. This information about Xenu, for example, is generally reserved for level 3 Thetans, and it's only intended to be purchased by members of the cult like Tom Cruise or John Travolta or the guy that played Hyde on that 70s show. And it's obviously kind of strange to consider that the man behind such a formidable and well-known empire as Scientology was at one time running around naked in the Mojave Desert with the founder of JPL while performing rituals and engaging in sex magic. Although I suppose in another way, when you look around the world today, it kind of makes sense. And the truth is that Scientology is not an anomaly, and Hubbard happens to be in good company. Take a look at this guy. This is Claude Vorilhon, the one-time sports journalist and auto racing fan that would later become Rael, the spiritual leader of his own religion called Raelianism, and another New Age messiah and alien messenger who is worshipped by thousands. Now, chances are that you've at least heard of this guy before, because Raelianism is among the most prominent UFO cults ever, claiming tens of thousands of members. And they've been all over TV and the media, and Saturday Night Live used to even have a skit making fun of them. And like Scientology, the Raelian movement has the funding and resources of a contemporary religion, which seems ironic to some because Raelism defines itself as an atheistic organization. And I would say that that's the one thing I agree with them about, you know, that atheism is in itself a religion. Raelism is actually a great example of that. And not only do they consider themselves to be an atheistic organization, but they also claim science to be the method by which they interpret the universe. And Rael is also the proudly perverted mastermind behind such events as Go Topless Day and numerous masturbation advocacy campaigns. And his cult is just obsessed with sex and with the public exhibition of it. And you know, you can't have sex all day without making some babies in the process. And that's why Raelians are also staunch advocates of abortion. You know, and they promote and contribute to causes like gay pride parades and transgender programs. And they campaign for things like condom vending machines in high schools. And they protest against things like pro-life rallies. And so to put it plainly, Raelism fits right in with our society, you know, now more than ever. And to the uninitiated mind, the Raelian movement would seem to be just a bunch of fun-loving, progressive hippies who just want to make love and not war, and happen to believe in aliens. But that's not to say they haven't had their fair share of public notoriety and criticism.
Rael, you may recognize testimony 5 for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me. I have a request is to include to my text a manifesto signed by 36 top scientists and philosophers of the world from New Humanist Association, including Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the DNA, and numerous Nobel Prize laureates who support the freedom for human cloning as part of freedom of science, be attached to my testimony.
That objection will be included in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to dedicate my testimony to Giordano Bruno, who was burned alive 4 centuries ago, sentenced to the death penalty by the Catholic Church for saying that there was life on other planets. Why did I ask Brigitte Boisselier to create the first human company in America? Because as the country of freedom, you have a constitution which should be a model for the whole world. And the most wonderful jewel of your system, the Supreme Court, which guarantees the respect of your constitution and the freedom of your citizen, against your own government and lawmakers. I'm quite confident that even if human cloning was banned, the Supreme Court of America would cancel this law as unconstitutional as they did for IVF.
In 1997, Rael established an organization that he called Clonaid, which engaged in the research and development of human cloning technology. And in 2002, the company claimed to have produced the first human clone, a baby girl named Eve. And yes, this was a direct reference to Eve from Genesis. And yet, despite this controversy, Raelism continues to grow even to this day. And they're always portrayed by the media to be this innocent group of wacky, tinfoil hat-wearing science fiction enthusiasts. But I just want to point out the blatantly blasphemous and satanic foundation of this group's doctrine. And after everything else that we've been through in this video, I think you will understand why. Now, according to the false message of Claude Vorion, or I'm sorry, Rael, we are all actually the descendants of alien gods who are known as the Elohim. And of course, this word Elohim is actually a Hebrew name for God that is used throughout the Old Testament. Now, according to the testimony of Rael, this all started in 1973 as he was wandering through some mountains in France when he came across an alien spaceship that was grounded near an inactive volcano. And according to Claude, he was then approached by a 25,000-year-old alien by the name of Yahweh. And of course, the name Yahweh is yet another biblical name for God the Father. And then, in a scene ripped straight from Star Wars, Yahweh goes on to reveal his true identity, proclaiming himself to be Claude's biological father. And this is a revelation that would immediately elevate Vorion from a modest sports writer and automobile enthusiast to a biological son of God. And according to Rael, this miraculous encounter would only be the first in an ongoing relationship, which he maintained with his alien dad and his Elohim cousins. And at some point, he was instructed to change his name to Rael, you know, because Claude just is not a fitting name for the Messiah. And in the religion of Raelism, he is accepted by his followers to be the true Son of God. And as such, his words and writings are regarded as authoritative scripture. And now, in the midst of all this biblical terminology, you might be wondering where Jesus fits into this picture. But unsurprisingly, Raelism has an answer for that too. You see, as it turns out, Jesus Christ himself was yet another alien prophet sent to earth by the Elohim, along with Moses, Elijah, Ezekiel, Buddha, John the Baptist, Muhammad, and even Joseph Smith. And by the account of Claude Vorilhon, he is the 40th and final prophet of the Elohim. And if you've been paying attention, then you would have noted by now that this use of biblical terminology is really prevalent within these New Age religions. And it's kind of weird because these magicians and sorcerers seem to look at the Bible as if it's another magical oracle and attempting to decipher the scriptures through an occult lens. And by the way, this is what mystery Babylonian teaching is all about. But I really think that Raelianism takes blasphemy to a whole nother level within the realm of these UFO cults, because the entire philosophy is just a distortion of scriptures that have been cherry-picked directly from the Bible. For example, according to the theology of Raelianism, the Garden of Eden from Genesis 1 is said to be an alien scientific laboratory, probably not too different from Rael's Clonade facility. And instead of Lucifer appearing to Eve and tempting her to eat of the forbidden fruit, according to Raelianism, Lucifer was yet another alien who led a group of scientists in a genetic engineering lab to study this created man's behavior. And the biblical fall of man was actually just the result of Lucifer telling the creation the truth about their existence. And this is a common perspective in Gnostic and occult literature, by the way, to present the character of Lucifer as an empathetic and heroic figure. And then Rael goes on to teach that Noah's Ark was actually a giant spaceship that was lifted up above Earth and used to preserve and store the genetic material that was later used to resurrect animals through cloning. Raelians do acknowledge the occurrence of the Great Flood, but they explain it to be the byproduct of an atomic missile explosion that the alien Elohim sent. And Raelians even have their own disturbing version of the biblical end times, one in which the third temple described in Revelation must be built in or near Jerusalem. But unlike the biblical interpretation of this prophecy, where the construction of this third temple ushers in the arrival of the Antichrist, for Raelians, the third temple will invite the arrival of, you guessed it, the Elohim aliens in their spaceships. And in case you're thinking that this stuff has fizzled out, then think again, as Raelians have reported making great progress in their pursuits as recently as 2022. And if you've been following my channel long enough, you know that the Raelians are not alone in this pursuit of building the third temple. And by the way, in case you disagree with my narrative of sci-fi entertainment being the primary catalyst and influence behind the emergence of these UFO cults, then I would like to point out this Benny Hinn-like outfit that Rael is always wearing. It's like a Halloween costume that was designed to reflect all of the corniest and most cliche elements of science fiction. Of course, he's wearing his famous Raelian pendant that features a swastika enclosed in the six-pointed star, and then this hair thing. I mean, you guys, come on. Why would he do this with his hair if not to impersonate some generic villain from the show Star Trek? I'm kidding, but I'm also serious. These origin stories, they're all just as fantastical and cliche as Hubbard's infamous space operas. And the names of these alien gods, Xenu, Orthon, Aetherius. It's enough to make you feel as if you're watching Mystery Science Theater 3000.
On the planet Semar, far within the Mufin galaxy, a decontrolled robot assassinated the omnipotent Balazar, who is known to possess the most brilliant mind in the universe. So powerful was Balazar's genius that as he lay dying, his brain ordered built a mechanism which would keep it alive even though his body was destroyed. And now Balazar's brain seeks universal conquest. The Council now is deciding what must be done.
As the proliferation of the UFO cults and contactee hype of the 1950s cooled down, the trajectory of modern UFO activity would take a dark turn when those lamb-like gray aliens would rear their truly ugly heads once again. They were ready to turn things up a notch, and common reports of benevolent alien communications were being replaced by reports of malevolent alien abductions. This new trend in the alien contact phenomenon started around 1961 with the famous case of Barney and Betty Hill, a married couple who was driving through the hills of New Hampshire late one September night when Betty spotted a uniquely bright light in the sky. And as she watched it, she noticed that this light was moving and behaving strangely. And she finally convinced Barney to pull over so that they could view the light through a set of binoculars that they had with them. And upon doing this, it became apparent that this light was actually a craft of some sort with multicolored flashing lights. And becoming frightened by the strange sighting, they decided to keep driving, but the craft followed them. And as they continued traveling along the winding roadways, the strange light remained within their proximity at all times, before eventually dropping down at a rapid speed and stopping directly above their vehicle. Barney would then exit the car with his binoculars in one hand and his handgun in the other, testifying that through his binoculars he had witnessed a number of these creatures through the windows on the ship. And at this point, a fog of confusion then fell onto the couple, and the next thing they remembered, they were arriving back at their house, but many hours after they should have. And that's why this case has been used as a primary example of the missing time phenomenon that many self-proclaimed abductees claim to experience. But it would also become a foundational case in the history of alien abductions. Now, although Barney and Betty had no clear recollection of the events that transpired immediately following their close encounter with the mysterious UFO, they sensed that they had been victims of a strange assault. They also began to discover strange anomalies and bits of evidence related to the event. Both of their watches had stopped ticking and would never work again. And there was an odd pink-colored film of powder that covered the dress that Betty wore that night. There were also strange markings on the car, things like this. But it wouldn't be until days and even weeks later that their abduction experience at the hands of these gray aliens would begin to trickle back into their memories. It happened first through vivid dreams that Betty was having. Barney was not convinced until they both underwent hypnosis much later and recounted an identical story about being taken aboard a mothership, being invasively evaluated by these alien beings, and receiving telepathic messages. And in the decades to follow, many similar stories of alien abductions would begin to emerge.
Of course, we could see them in the opening coming from, when they started out the craft. But
Did you think it was people coming out at first?
Well, they had. I kind of thought it was people at first, off like that. But of course, when they appeared there in front of me, it was the most shock I've ever had in my life.
I think it's interesting that such a large portion of these abduction claims are revealed through the use of hypnosis. I mean, just imagine how utterly terrifying, and shocking and amazing it would be if you were the subject of one of these alien abductions, or even just a close encounter for that matter. I mean, to actually witness it with your own eyes, and then you're going to turn around and tell me you don't remember a single detail from the event. I don't know. In fairness, I guess it makes sense to a degree, because it is possible as a result of experiencing a traumatic event, if the impact is overwhelming enough, for your brain to automatically block that memory from your mind. It's an instinct of self-preservation that's called mental dissociation, and in a way, it's sort of a merciful facet of God's creation that enables a victim to cope with the aftermath of extreme trauma. And, and I think it goes without saying that to experience something so terrifying and traumatic as an alien abduction should certainly be enough to trigger this effect of mental dissociation. However, mental dissociation is not the only reported cause to this effect of abductees forgetting their experience. In fact, while under hypnosis, some abductees have even claimed that their memories were deliberately erased by these alien captors. Something akin to that little memory wiping device that Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones used in the movie Men in Black. The first reported use of hypnotic regression as a technique to study alien abductions was actually in the case that we just discussed of Barney and Betty Hill, who underwent hypnosis in 1964, which was 2 years after their alleged alien abduction experience. And these sessions were conducted by Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist who specialized in hypnosis. And this method of using hypnosis in therapy was considered really controversial at that time. Actually, it still is now. But even more so in the 1960s, and so this was kind of a one-off thing with Barney and Betty Hill. However, years later in the 1980s, the famous Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs would go on to popularize the use of regressive hypnosis in the investigation of alien abductions. And the goal of regressive hypnosis is to induce a trance-like state in the subject, which allows them to recall memories or experiences that may have been forgotten or repressed due to mental dissociation, like we just spoke on. And then by guiding the subject through these memories, the therapist can help them to relive and describe any experiences related to their alleged abduction. I mean, it seems stupid, and it is stupid, but if you trust in this method, I could see why you would come away believing in alien abductions, because it turns out that many people under hypnosis have made familiar claims of being abducted and subjected to similar objectifications. Actually, an unproportionately large number of people report this type of thing under hypnosis. But here's the thing about hypnosis. Well, for one, it's extremely easy to influence somebody that's under hypnosis. I mean, duh, right? That's the whole purpose of hypnosis in the first place. And plus, when the primary source of such reports are coming from people like Bud Hopkins or John E. Mack, who are practically ufologists that are directly affiliated with the research of alien abductions, well, then it's pretty easy to detect a conflict of interest here. But second, even under the most honest circumstances and in the most professional setting, hypnosis can never reveal any information beyond the perception of the subject. You know, it's not an accurate representation of the actual event. It's merely a descriptive account of the way that said event was perceived by the subject. In other words, it's coming from the mind and soul of the person being hypnotized, you know, which happens to be the very place where we would expect for oppressive demonic spirits to dwell in the situation that this was demonic, in fact. And based on what I read in the Bible, I actually believe that demonic oppression and possession is far more common than people realize today. You know, and if the subject under hypnosis really was experiencing demonic activity, well, then even an unbiased secular psychologist would be at a loss to articulate or to define it properly. And there are many examples of this, but one instance that comes to my mind is the book Communion by Whitley Strieber. Strieber is a fictional horror writer who claims to have undergone numerous interactions with extraterrestrial beings. Yes, the gray lamb type. And much like Barney and Betty Hill, Strieber's experiences were also supposedly hidden in the recesses of his subconscious mind until he underwent hypnosis by the famous Bud Hopkins, which then unearthed vivid memories of his terrifying encounters with these beings. Now, I first read the book Communion when I was in my early 20s, and I got to admit that despite being entertained by the premise of the story, I really didn't believe Strieber's claims to be true. You know, because he was already an accomplished author who specialized in writing on similar topics before publishing his own alleged true story. And it just happens to be a pretty convenient encounter for somebody in that particular line of work, you know. But sure enough, it became his first bestseller. And at the time that I read Communion, as well as a plethora of other UFO and alien-related books, I actually believed in the conventional perception of the UFO phenomenon. You know, and that it represented the interstellar exploration of alien creatures from distant planets and the whole 9 yards, you know, but I still considered Strieber's story to be untrue. However, I was struck by the spiritual language in which he described these experiences. The title itself, Communion, being a reference to a shared heritage with these beings. Like many other abductees, he suffered from sleep paralysis, and he claimed that they would control his body. And interestingly, he described the aliens to smell like sulfur, an odor that is commonly associated with demonic activity. And he also described the beings themselves, as well as the spacecraft, in religious terminology, you know, and noted that some of them were reminiscent of the Sumerian goddess Ishtar, you know, and he was poked and prodded and seduced and psychologically molested, and he came away from it all with a heightened sense of spiritual awareness, you know. He described it like a spiritual awakening. And whether Strieber's story is true or not, his book is a good example of how hypnosis has been instrumental in the development of the common abduction narrative, and it just so happens to be another illustration of how the alien and UFO phenomenon is commonly associated with elements of spirituality. And so let's step back and consider all of this information in context with the biblical reality of demonic possession. I mean, isn't it strange that so many of these alleged close encounters result in some type of spiritual experience? I mean, it's honestly become like a cliche stereotype, you know, where the abductee or experiencer begins an ongoing relationship with the alien entities and then becomes obsessed or perhaps possessed, you know. And there tends to be a strong element of spirituality and intimacy there with the extraterrestrials. And then in a twist that's eerily reminiscent to the amazing events of Genesis chapter 6, with the Nephilim, many of these interactions with the gray aliens reportedly involve the harvesting of human sperm and eggs to create hybrid creatures. And this scenario has been described by a truly staggering number of abductees. And sometimes the abductee will even claim that they will have continuing visits or visions from the offending aliens to meet with their alien hybrid child, you know. And I know it's crazy, but perhaps no less crazy than the pursuits of Jack Parsons and Cameron with their moon child, you know. And remember what Lamb told Crowley, it's all in the egg.
And while it is still very difficult for us to believe that a spaceship landed and that robot-type creatures came out and actually took these two people into the spaceship, these men, in my opinion, believed that they saw this and that they were being honest in reporting what they have reported.
But, from a rational standpoint, you just can't explain this type of intimate or even spiritual human interaction from mere interstellar travelers who are pursuing their own ambitions, I mean, what real-life cause could motivate these aliens to abduct or possess or torment and manipulate the minds and bodies of human beings?
We number in the many thousands. We are projecting to you with all of our hearts the infinite love that stems from the most high dimensions.
Save up to 80% on your New Age books, records, CDs, audio, and videotapes with no obligation whatever by joining the New Age Media Club.
Read about the reality of extraterrestrial life and the future of Earth within an interplanetary confederation in a new book, Preparation for the Landing, by cosmic visionary Uriel, published by the Unarius Educational Foundation.
The New Age America Video Catalog lets you meet the leading spokespersons, companies, and products within the New Age industry. The New Age America Video Catalog is your key to the future, featuring New Age music, crystals, astrology, numerology, spirituality, books, UFOs, and much, much more.
Preparation for the Landing. Are you ready?
I fully acknowledge that I wouldn't know the first thing about what motivates the pursuits of an extraterrestrial, or of Lamb, but we do know from Scripture what motivates the pursuits of Satan and of his demons. We know that Satan wanders about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, as written in 1 Peter 5. He blinds the minds of unbelievers, he exploits a lack of understanding, he imitates religious roles, he misuses Scripture, he attacks the faith of believers, and he indulges the delusions of unbelievers. And as we went over before, not only is he a liar, but he's described by Jesus as the father of lies. And he's also the God of this world, so perhaps those two things combined make sense when you take a look at this world around you. And so that's the demonic motivations of our enemy, to persecute the truth of God's word and those who believe and follow it, and then to lead everybody else into deception. But to complete my point, although society may have done away with the contactee movement and with the proliferation of these UFO cults that were emerging in the 1950s, it's pretty apparent that public interest in alien abductions began to grow rapidly in the early 1980s, alongside a dramatic increase of real-life abduction reports and many more reported cases of close encounters of the third kind. And I think that this increase was undoubtedly influenced by the sweeping cultural impact that movies and entertainment were having on society by this time. The 1980s brought a booming economy to Hollywood. It was a generation characterized by pop culture and social trends. And MTV was unleashed on society, subjecting the masses to this MK Ultra style mind control. And pop stars like Michael Jackson and Madonna were spending million-dollar budgets on music videos and stage performances. And really, entertainment had never been more profitable. Film budgets were bigger, and special effects had entered a new tier of technical ability. It was a futuristic generation, replete with a wide array of new technologies, from personal computers and video game consoles to camcorders, VCRs, and cable television. So never before was this fantasy world so immersive and so easily accessible. And so when I see these statistics that show a big spike of interest in alien close encounters and abductions, and then when I consider the fact that the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out in 1977, I'm not that surprised by it. I think it's fair to assume that most people didn't even know what a close encounter of the third kind was before the movie came out. And there was also a burgeoning industry for conspiracy-based entertainment by this time. And thousands of books were published with titles like The Truth About Roswell and The Flying Saucers Are Real. And the belief that governments were engaged in conspiracies and cover-ups was steadily becoming more popular. For example, the story of Barney and Betty Hill had now become a national headline through the success of the book Interrupted Journey by John Fuller. And Americans were starting to develop a healthy but misguided distrust in government, because a lot had changed since the inception of the UFO and contactee movement in the 1950s. New technologies had enabled an expansion in media and in media consumption, and although things like government corruption and conspiracy were nothing new, they had never before received this level of coverage. And events like the assassination of JFK or the questions around the moon landing and the Watergate scandal had planted a seed of doubt in public trust. And from the 1980s onward, this proliferation of alien invasion movies has only grown. And the lamb-like grays would become today's stereotypical expression of an alien, And the popular alien-themed science fiction at this time would also start to shift into darker themes, more commonly depicting these spiritual and psychological elements that I just spent the last 2 hours relating to demonic possession. often with humans as the helpless victims and the prey of these aliens, as opposed to the heroes and conquerors that the more innocent old-timers imagined us as. And the old narrative of friendly space brothers inviting contactees to join them on guided space tours, aboard their flying saucers, well, those stories disappeared, only to be replaced by a new narrative of these malevolent interdimensional aliens manifesting into the bedrooms of terrified humans to initiate a terrible sequence of torture and abuse. And this transition was accommodated by a new brand of contactee movement as well.
If I would title this tape, it would be Last Chance to Evacuate Planet Earth Before It Is Recycled.
It's been 20 years since 39 members of the Heaven's Gate cult were found dead, their bodies discovered under purple shrouds inside a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe.
Ties to a cult may have led to a fatal shooting in Monroe County. A woman is now in custody for shooting her boyfriend in the head.
They're all believed to be members of the Solar Temple cult. It's the second time in 14 months that members of the cult have perished. 53 members died in apparent murder-suicides in Switzerland and Quebec in October of last year.
The members executed their plan by drinking a lethal vodka phenobarbital cocktail, then laying down to die, hoping to enter an alien spacecraft.
It's the largest suicide in United States history, and it has all the components of just being so bizarre.
Overseas now, the charred bodies of 16 people, including 3 children, were found today.
500 officers were involved in the manhunt. It began on Friday when cars were found in the forest belonging to cult members. The 16 burned bodies were discovered this morning a couple of kilometers from the parking lot.
Claiming she shot her boyfriend, 32-year-old Stephen Mineo, and he was dead. Rogers told police she and Mineo were members of a cult centered on aliens and raptures, headed by a woman named Sherry Schreiner.
A story that shocked the world, the story of the Solar Temple cult.
The 1994 deaths were thought to be timed astrologically.
Hello? Yes, I need to report an anonymous tip. Who do I talk to?
Okay. This is regarding what?
This is regarding a mass suicide, and I can give you the address.
Investigators say the cult was obsessed with death and considered it an illusion. Experts say cult leaders told their followers that fire would lead them to a new world on another planet.
21 women and 18 men had taken their own lives.
Let me say that our mission here at this time is about to come to a close.
Their bodies were found lying in a star formation with their feet in the middle. Authorities say brush and trees stacked up around the clearing were likely used to light the bodies on fire. The same star formation was used in October 1994. The bodies of 48 members of the Doomsday Cult were found in burned-down buildings in a small town in Switzerland. 5 more bodies were found in a burned house in Quebec.
The judge who led the inquiry says at least 30 were simply murdered in a well-planned, carefully arranged ritual. Members of the Solar Temple were bound by a death pact, but the Swiss believe this was more like mass assassination. The leader, Joseph de Mambro from Quebec, was described as an obsessed and dangerous paranoid. He was the one who ordered the transit, the voyage that would take followers to another planet.
They were all in identical positions, face up on a mattress, everyone wearing their black outfit, Nike shoes, and most covered with purple shrouds.
We might see you all again, and then we might not, but we hope that you remember us as we were, and not how other people are going to try and tell you that we are. And one last thing we'd like to say is 39 to beam up. Thank you.
I'm frustrated to admit that even by this point, I feel like we've only scratched the surface of this topic. But I think that I've covered enough to thoroughly illustrate the fact that this alien agenda that's continuing to develop all around us is intimately attached to demonic activity. And if you already believed that, like I'm sure a lot of you have, at least now you have some evidence and facts to back up your position. But fortunately, we don't need to rely on my speculations and amateur research to figure this out, because thanks to the efforts of the CE4 research group, we now have some amazing statistics that will add a giant exclamation point to the end of every claim that I've made. And after dwelling in darkness for the last 2 hours, I would like to end on a positive note and introduce you to the last ufologist on my list, Joseph Jordan. Because in a community that is dominated by deception, Jordan stands as a beacon of hope. He is the president and founder of the CE4 Research Group, an alien abduction investigation and research program. And he's been a prolific MUFON field investigator for over 30 years, and his research findings on alien abductions have been published in numerous books and included in countless lectures over the past 3 decades. So needless to say, he's about as legit as a ufologist can be. And yet there's something that differentiates Joe from the majority of his colleagues. He is a born-again and Bible-believing Christian. But he didn't start his career that way. He was initially compelled to pursue the UFO question for the same reason that everybody else did, including myself, to prove or disprove the existence of aliens. Of course, most often the motivation was to prove it, though. And like many of his peers, he was a self-described New Ager who associated with all the New Age elements of this subculture that we've previously expounded on throughout this whole video. But his testimony of faith traces back to the early days of his research. Sometime in 1996, he was investigating 2 separate incidents which were particularly sinister and left Jordan feeling a bit shaken and disturbed. And later, when he was discussing the situation with a Christian friend of his, she warned him that he was dealing with an evil force and that he needed protection. And so Joe reaches into his pocket to retrieve his crystals, in accordance with his New Age beliefs, but instead his friend pulled out a Bible. And in a quote from Jordan that I took from creation.com, he said, "It was the first time I'd ever heard a true gospel presentation and understood what Christianity was really all about." So after becoming saved and with a new understanding of spiritual warfare, Jordan was now equipped to see what is invisible to those without eyes to see it.
They're at a loss to try and explain what's being seen and recorded because they don't have that foundation.
Right.
To judge. Their foundation of science and math is not deep enough to answer the questions. Okay? Where just open the Bible and they'll answer it for you, perfectly, just perfectly.
Jordan's research, which spans over 3 decades, offers a biblical perspective on the alien abduction phenomenon. He asserts that invoking the name of Jesus Christ has proven to have an astonishing effect on stopping these experiences, a claim that stands in stark contrast to the unsuccessful and hopeless methods suggested by other experts in the field. In fact, in a survey of 200 individuals who reported ongoing abduction experiences, Joe found that 72% were able to stop the experiences by simply invoking the name of Jesus Christ. And furthermore, his group defends that 100% of his subjects who have come to accept salvation in the gospel of Christ have received complete deliverance from the so-called alien visitations that had been tormenting them.
That's the one hope that I can bring in my research, is that you can put an end to all of that fear with this phenomenon. If you're somebody that needs fear to thrive off and live off of, there's other fears out there you can choose from. But this one name over this phenomenon. And not just for the abductions. I mean, I've got recorded cases where people have been right out in an absolute UAP sighting with all the craziness involved in it. And they call on the name and authority of Jesus Christ and watch that thing just back up and disappear.
Nice.
Yeah,
so you
nice.
say Jesus' name out loud.
Out loud.
And so let's distinguish, because there's people who've got deliverance ministries where it's very me-centered, and you pay a person to say special prayers, in quotes, to cast out demons. This is not deliverance ministry. This is speaking the name of the Lord.
No, this isn't. In 30 years, I've never had to use personal deliverance on anybody.
No.
With these. It's teaching the people to have that personal relationship themselves with Jesus Christ. And it's Jesus Christ that's going to deliver them.
And many of these testimonies are available for you to watch or listen to or read through at his website, alienresistance.org.
wasn't until I got to the biblical viewpoint of this was I see every answer just falling in place. That gave it a probability of that's what this is. It's more apt to be this than that. We can say that because of the message that they bring and the activity and the purpose that they're showing. Right. Everything appears to be deceptive. The communication that comes from them, mostly during the contactee experience and the abduction experience where there is communication, it's never to support anything biblically. Yeah. It's always to pick it apart. God isn't who you think he is. Jesus was just another of the visitors we sent, to help you along through time. Wow. It doesn't separate his deity, as God in the flesh that was on earth.
And they're taking credit for sending him too.
Yeah, they take credit for it.
Like they're God. Oh my goodness.
Right. They tend to push the idea that they're our creators, instead of God. The whole concept is they're bringing an alien gospel to Earth, but you have to look at and see that that's what this is about. They're here as messengers, as missionaries, on a mission to change our thinking. People that are falling for the con have nothing to judge the con man by. They have no foundation to say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, where we do. And that's why I believe it's so important that we get this message out there.
An Air Force veteran and former intelligence official is going public about a secret government UFO recovery program he says has been collecting alien spacecraft for decades. In recent years, the government has taken a more public role in acknowledging sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena.
So I published the first part of this series back in October of 2022, and a lot has happened since then in regard to this pressing alien deception agenda, and I kind of feel like I'm racing against the clock at this point, just to make sure I get the information out before the inevitable arrival might occur. And I guess it's just in God's sovereign design that I would happen to be covering this topic in such depth right now, right in the midst of its emergence in the world around us. Because it's not like I've had a vision from God, and I don't view myself as a messenger or anything weird like that. I'm merely just following the script of the agenda, just like I've always done with this channel. And since the beginning of the pandemic, which, is kind of the great Trojan horse of Agenda 2030, I have watched every bullet point that was once regarded to be a conspiracy theory just systematically rolled out in predictable procession. And this alien agenda is like the mother of all conspiracy theories. And it's associated with a government cover-up that's so deep, it would make the Watergate scandal seem like a shining example of government transparency. And I think that a lot of us already know that it's only a matter of time before this final card gets played.
I was introduced to the late Dr. Wernher von Braun in the U.S., the father of rocketry. He said to me, "Carol, you will stop the weaponization of space. And we have to prevent the weaponization of space because there is a lie being told to everyone that the weaponization of space is now first being based upon the evil empire, the Russians. Then there would be terrorists. Then there would be third world countries. Now we call them rogue nations or nations of concern. Then there would be asteroids. And then he would repeat to me over and over, and the last card would be the extraterrestrial threat."
Now, this isn't the first time that I've had to apologize for this, but once again, I've let my mouth get ahead of my head by stating that this would be the final part in this series, because I was wrong. This may have been my longest film yet, and there is still so much more that we have to get through. And in the next part of this series, we're going to go on to explore plenty of evidence to show how the U.S. government itself has been the leading source behind the perpetuation of this alien deception. But what's more important to understand as we close this up is that this agenda is first and foremost a spiritual one. And in my opinion, it's one that is tied directly to the coming great delusion that is prophesied in scriptures.
And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming, even him whose coming is after the workings of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they received not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe a lie.
The Bible teaches that Satan aspires to deceive the world with signs and wonders. In Matthew 24, Jesus teaches his disciples about the signs of the end times. And in verse 24, the Bible says, "For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." Now, to be clear, I'm not telling you that this scripture has any relation to UFOs or aliens. And I wholly acknowledge that the Bible does not explicitly describe what we think of as aliens or UFOs at all, really. And likewise, this verse is not addressing extraterrestrials, but fraudulent human ministers, And just as the verse promises, we have already seen and continue to see many false Christs and prophets. Although I can't say I've been too impressed by any of their signs or wonders quite yet, the reality is that this spirit of Antichrist is already here, and many small a Antichrists have already come and gone. And if you recall, even Jack Parsons himself declared himself to be an Antichrist, and the infamous Moonchild that he worked tirelessly to create was, for all intents and purposes, intended to be the actual Antichrist. But these guys have always been around, these spiritual and religious megalomaniacs who masquerade as prophets and accept worship from their followers. But the Bible tells us that these types of figures will increase in the end times. And here we are. And as I finally draw this movie to a close, I just want to reflect on the fact that this wild cast of real-life characters who I profiled in this film are only a small representation of a much larger community. And while they all have their own radically unique claims of alien encounters, they all shared the same underlying pursuit: to initiate the arrival of a new age, a new world, or an Aeon of Horus. And the Bible teaches us that there is a greater deception coming. One that is clearly being constructed right in front of us, if you ask me. And I think that we should think long and hard about just how deep this deception might go. Because I think that there's a good reason why the satanic ruling forces of this fallen world would seek to condition humanity to expect the arrival of beings from the sky. Perhaps to discredit the return of Christ, right? Or perhaps to persuade humanity into accepting the arrival of somebody else. And these are merely just the speculations of one man, and I always like to acknowledge that I could be wrong about this stuff, but I hope that after all of this information that I've shared with you, that you would agree that the father of lies likely has some big plans for this UFO agenda. I mean, the programming is obvious. What was once an overused science fiction plot has become the subject of mainstream news headlines. And I think it's fair to assert that if a multitude of angels descended from the sky tomorrow, the Antichrist media would likely report it as an alien invasion. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to acknowledge the fact that society has been conditioned through entertainment to embrace a belief in this narrative. And you know what? Before I wrote this, I had cultivated a long list of potentially accommodating scriptures to include throughout the narration of this video. But I ultimately decided to leave most of them out because I would never want to misappropriate the word of God or misuse it to make a point that is outside of its original context. But I do think that it's a worthy idea for the mature Christian to ponder, because when we see all this stuff going on in our world, lining up with these prophecies, then I think we should talk about it. Because the purpose of biblical prophecy is to inform us of real-life events that will actually occur. And so there's nothing wrong with looking into these prophecies and comparing them to the conditions of our times. I mean, you could argue that that's the very purpose of its inclusion in the preserved word. We have to remember that the prophecies described in the book of Revelation and elsewhere in the Bible, they're there for us to accept, regardless of how one might interpret the text beforehand. And we can't get so jaded by the televangelists and phony charismatic charlatans that we lose faith in the supernatural, because we worship a supernatural God. We worship a God that parted the seas from his throne in heaven, and also walked upon its waves in human form. We worship a God of miracles, and our Bible describes a coming event that will defy the logic of all who witness it. An event that will shake the powers of heaven, according to Luke chapter 21. An event that will cause the hearts of men to fail from fear, or in modern translation, something so terrifying and so incredible that men will actually faint at the sight of its presence. So you tell me, could alien spaceships be involved in something like that? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. But I could tell you this, the day will come when many unbelievers and enemies of God on the earth will look up and see something appear in the sky that will be far more dangerous to them than any UFO or aliens or fleet of spaceships. It'll be the returning Son of God, a glorious sight for some and a horrifying reality check for others. Interesting and multifaceted as this topic is, it's trivial in comparison to the basic gospel. I want you to know that the Bible does not really focus on the end times all that much. It's something that I feel inclined to mention because I know that a lot of you misunderstand the extent to which the Bible is concerned with these things. And I just sense the need to briefly explain that the main focus of the Bible is the gospel of Jesus Christ and the promise that we can all be forgiven for our sins and delivered from the penalty of our sin. And I know that a significant portion of my subscribers are more interested in conspiracy theories than Bible studies. But don't be deceived into accepting an attitude of doom and gloom when it comes to these topics. The Bible is a book of life, and God is a good and loving God. And the gospel is all about forgiveness and redemption. So for those of you who are not believers, I just want you to know that despite the disturbing nature of these topics, it's nothing to be feared for those of us who love the Lord. You got to remember that the purpose of these biblical signs is to warn believers about a coming persecution and to signal God's children of Christ's imminent return. But not so that we could build a bunker or stockpile ammo, but so that we would spread the gospel with a sense of urgency, knowing that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And for Christians who long to be united with God, we are honestly kind of strangely encouraged as our society slips further down this satanic slope, because it only strengthens our faith that God is in control as we see the promises in His Word being fulfilled in the midst of this lost and fallen world. So if you're sitting on the sidelines of this spiritual battle, I urge you to reconsider your doubts in light with the information that's revealed in this film and really in any production of Fallen World films. And so with that said, I look forward to seeing you guys on the next part of this series when I will finally explain why I have consistently referred to a coming fake or staged alien invasion throughout this series. And for those of you who have been waiting for it, this is where we're going to get into Project Bluebeam and Project Blue Book and a lot of other projects that don't include the word blue. And we will explore some amazing evidence that just might change your perspective on everything that you thought you knew about the relationship between governments and aliens, demons, and a little something called propaganda. So I hope that you'll join me again for the continuation of this study. But until then, God bless you all, and I hope that you'll consider subscribing to Fallen World Films and to help me share this video. As you can imagine, this channel is shadow banned to virtual invisibility. But I'll remind you, this channel is unmonetized, and at this point in my filmmaking career, I have yet to collect a single dime for my efforts. In fact, I've only lost money on this channel. And I don't say that to garner your sympathy, but just to help you understand the passion that goes into these productions. So if you'd like to help me out a little and support what I'm trying to do here, all I ask is for you to please like and share this video so that more people might benefit from its message. So I want to thank you for giving me your time, and I hope that you found some value in this film. And until the next one, I'm signing off. This is Tim from Fallen World Films.
Astronomer and UFO skeptic Carl Sagan once remarked that we cannot discount the possibility that alien evangelists are wandering the universe, looking for souls to save. Sagan does not believe that aliens have visited Earth yet, but a lot of other people do. A confirmed contact with them would certainly change the way we all look at the world, and it might even affect our religious beliefs.